We go. Here we go. Dude, what do you got for us today?
Oh, we're gonna talk about well, we left off with the floods. We're gonna pick up right after that.
Okay.
We're gonna get a little bit of Nimrod, Abraham, the Jaredites,
Nice.
that time period. Yep.
Nice. Well, dude, fire it up. Let's go.
Okay, so Hugh Nibley talks about this period, and he has interesting commentary. He says across the board, it's interesting that there's no religious literature that really covers this period of time.
Why do you think that is?
I don't know because he also says the secular history is there, and so that stuff's way different, right? So you can go back into like the kings lists, the kings of Assyria and like Sumer and Babylon, and like they
Mm-hmm.
were keeping history, and so you got the myths and the legends and stuff that are written down from them. But Jewish, the Bible doesn't have a whole lot going on for this time period. The Quran doesn't, Christianity doesn't, and even apocryphal or pseudepigraphal. Um, Documents don't really cover this. Like, there's no Christian apocrypha or pseudepigrapha that attribute stories from later authors even to this time period, right?
Okay.
But if people, I don't have anything on this, but if people are interested, you know, uh, you can go into the early histories of Babylon, Egypt, Assyria. Um, like one of the characters that historians equate with, they equate the mythological Nimrod from our
Mm-hmm.
Bible with the historical Sargon of Akkad.
Okay.
And in Genesis, it says that the city of Akkad or Akkad was the beginning of Nimrod's kingdom,
Okay.
right? And so Sargon was one of the great kings and warlords of that time.
So,
And so Nimrod is
and it was
attributed.
called Sargon?
Sargon was the leader, was the man. Sargon of Akkad,
Sounds like something that should come out of like Lord of the Rings.
right? Like Sauron, right?
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's got that ring to it.
And but history will tell you for the Akkadian Empire is distinct from Babylon. Like it predated Babel, like what we call Babylon. So
Right.
you have the Sumerians. They're famous for the first like non-pictographical graphical language, like because like Egyptian hieroglyphics are older, but then the Sumerians invented cuneiform as like the first script, and that was used by the same script was adopted by different cultures, even if they had different languages, and I don't know exactly how that works. I'm not a linguist. I wish I was. But for example, so Sumerians invented it, but then the Akkadians adopted the cuneiform, and they kind of blended the Sumerians and Akkadians. Then Babylon took over after and adopted the cuneiform language. The Hittites used the cuneiform language and they're like Turkey, Anatolia, Asia Minor,
Sure.
right? The cities in Syria, like Ugarit, they spoke a different language group that was Semitic languages, closer to like Hebrew, but they didn't have a Hebrew script. They used the cuneiform script and
Gotcha.
adapted it to their language. The Assyrians also adapted the cuneiform script to Assyrian.
Gotcha. Okay.
You know, but Akkad is different than Babylon, but the scholars equate Sargon and Nimrod. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not.
Okay.
Gilgamesh is the Babylonian equivalent. Sometimes people say the mythological Gilgamesh is equivalent to Nimrod. Maybe that's true.
Interesting.
Embellished, obviously,
Okay.
probably, but could be that Gilgamesh was based off of, or he was the embellishment based off of a historical Nimrod. But you also have this history is also preserved in other myths, like in Europe, for example. Nibley talks about. Let's see if I can find it. He talks about how there's motifs of the Mad Hunter, this archetype. This Mad Hunter. He's crazy and or deranged, but he is in rebellion against the gods. Wants to be the ruler of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but kind of this Genghis Khan kind of
Right.
figure, right? Mongol warlord, but it's European or
Right.
whatever. And so there's like these myths exist across
Okay.
different nations and cultures. And so that shows you, okay, this originated somewhere. And the Jewish version in the Old Testament is that Nimrod was a hunter
Right.
before the Lord, right?
Right.
And I think our Joseph Smith translation says he was rebellious before the Lord, which goes hand in hand with the commentary that exists already, the old commentary, like Talmudic commentary. But so there seems to be an ancient origin, but we don't have documentation
Okay.
about details terribly. So we'll do the best we can.
Right.
Right. But Nibley does say that the one exception, religious, as far as a religious text, is in the Book of Mormon with the Book of Ether.
Right.
That's the only book that we really have. And it's not quite up to snuff because we don't really have the full Book of Ether. We have our Book of
Right.
Ether, which is different because it's Mormon. It's really Mormons or
Abridgment.
Moroni's abridgment of the Book of Ether.
Right.
But we don't have the 24 gold plates that Ether actually created.
Okay.
Right. But we know it did exist, and the Nephites had it. Anyway, however, this period, despite the fact that there's not much historical, religious commentary on this period of time, it's very critical because this is the end of the prologue in the Bible.
Right.
You know, the first 14 chapters or so is what I would call a prologue to
Abraham.
the main point. One thing I heard said to, it was said to me that always resonated with me was the whole point of the whole Bible is a commentary on the divine family of Abraham and Sarah,
Right.
the eternal family of Abraham and Sarah.
Right. And this is the one story before, this is the last story before we get to Abraham. Right.
It ends the prologue and is the transition to the main point.
Right. Now, let me ask you this. Is there any overlap between Noah, Nimrod, and Abraham as far as being alive?
Yeah, if you believe the literal genealogy records that says, for example, let's say I think it says that Noah lived 300 years after the flood and Shem, his son, lived 500 years after the flood. Interestingly enough, that has Shem outliving Abraham based on when he was born.
Whoa.
And I think there's two conflicting dates with Abraham's birth because you have the Genesis account and then you have Chronicles.
Okay.
Which Chronicles begins again with Adam.
Gotcha.
And, we discussed this a little bit earlier in the other podcast with the documentary hypothesis. The idea being that yes, with the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, you have different authors who contributed, or scribes took different source materials and contributed a final product that was Ephraim, Judah, or priests, the Levites, and then the Deuteronomists, and a bunch of redacting,
Sure.
and it all came together. But there's, in that same vein of thought, Chronicles is thought to be predominantly the Ephraimite version of the history, while what's after Joshua's after Deuteronomy. Joshua through Second Kings is considered the Jewish or the Judaic, the tribe of Judah version of the history. So you have 2 different dates, I think, for Abraham. And I think one of them, I don't recall which one it is, it says he was born 273 years after the flood, which means if you believe those things to be literal, that Noah lived 27 years. Noah lived until Abraham was 27 years old, according to that, right?
Right.
For that date, if he was born on that one version, right, that account. And then Shem outlived him by 327 years.
Okay.
Or lived 327 years past that point. Abraham lived to be 175. You guys can do the math.
And do you think it's because of that overlap that the idea that Shem was Melchizedek come into play there?
That's a hard one to say because as I've looked into that, there's a lot of different thoughts on why Shem is equated to Melchizedek.
Okay.
And we can get into that. I don't know if I want to get into that right now. But,
no, that's fine.
But there's different traditions on that. Because you have Talmudic, which is like your rabbinical commentary. But even that's contradictory, and then there's other Dead Sea Scrolls type stuff that's not Talmudic commentary that does not equate.
Okay.
The Book of Enoch, the books of Enoch that we've talked about does not equate Shem and Melchizedek.
Interesting.
Now, I'm not saying
right
that he's not.
No,
But
no. Look, I haven't made up my mind. I haven't seen enough evidence one way or another.
a lot of LDS scholars will point out to D&C 138, which I am critical of for other reasons. And I guess I'll probably have to defend that right now. People think it's a revelation and that Joseph F. Smith had this vision in like November of 1918 before he died. Oh, like this idea of work for the dead on the other side was revealed, and we see that Christ didn't personally teach to the dead, and but he set up a missionary program and they went and did that. But people against the Adam God doctrine will use that as a stick against people like you and me who believe in the Adam
Right.
God doctrine because Joseph F. Smith says that he sees Michael as a spirit, Adam there,
Interesting.
right? And so I'm like squinting at it now already, immediately. And a while ago, I was going through the Journal of Discourses, and Brigham Young was teaching that stuff about the missionary program being set up by Christ, and Christ didn't literally teach all the individual souls of the dead.
Interesting.
He was teaching that in 1867.
Okay. So
You
that
know,
predates Joseph
yeah,
Smith.
so it's not a revelation as far as new content being presented to the
Right.
church at that point. It is not a new idea being presented in 1918. It wasn't even canonized until 1985, by the way.
Gotcha. Okay.
So I have no problem with Joseph F. Smith having a dream about it because
Right.
he says he was studying Second Peter
Right.
and then fell asleep and then was dreaming about it, right? I got no problem with that. We know, or people suspect, despite Joseph F. Smith's advocacy of the Adam God doctrine in his early years, during his presidency, he kind of moved away from that paradigm for reasons I am not qualified to comment on.
Okay.
But it seems that he did. Jacob Vidrine might have more details on that.
Check.
I think he did a YouTube video on that on his YouTube channel.
Okay.
And
Interesting.
so I call bias and see bias in that revelate, that canonized vision or dream.
Gotcha. Okay.
In any case, but back to the point with Melchizedek, in that dream, Joseph F. Smith words it that I saw Shem, the great high priest.
Okay.
And LDS scholars have equated that with saying, well, the only great high priest mentioned in other places is either Jesus Christ or Melchizedek.
Okay.
Therefore, it seems that there's a good rhetorical connection that Shem is Melchizedek because Joseph F. Smith called Shem the great high priest.
Interesting. Okay. All right.
Maybe true.
Makes sense.
And John Taylor did equate Shem and Melchizedek.
That makes sense.
But,
Okay.
But that was a common rabbinical Judaic position at that time. So it'd be easy for them to hear that interpretation. Like they didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls and other things at that time to give a
Right.
counterpoint, right?
Right. They're making some assumptions based on the information at hand.
Mhm.
Okay.
Good question, though, by the way. So yeah, after the flood, we start out with what's called the Table of Nations, and that lists all the different groups of peoples that the Hebrews would have been in contact with during their history. Now, there's not necessarily a reason to believe, as some very literalist, dogmatic people who study the Bible, would assert, that, those kind of assertions are so funny, that this is like comprehensive.
Right.
Like these are all the peoples of the earth. And a lot of studies have been done to show, like, okay, like Javan, the son of Japheth, like what peoples did he father? It seems like that's like the Greeks, for example, and there's good connections there. For example, in Greek mythology, one of the Titans, if you're familiar with Greek mythology, the generation before Zeus, you have Prometheus, Atlas, Kronos, Rhea, all of those.
Those Titans.
Yeah, those Titans, So one of Zeus's uncles was Iapetus. That's Japheth or Iapetus.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
And and he was considered the father of the Greeks in some literature,
Hmm.
And so that stacks pretty well together,
Okay.
in my opinion.
Is there some common ideas surrounding that figure that line up with Japheth?
There could be. I never researched that. I should have.
Okay.
But But anyway, research has been done to like show like, okay, where are these people that the Genesis table of nations talks about? But to my knowledge, there's no account for like East Asian nations,
Gotcha.
right?
Okay.
And so like you have the Chinese and Japanese and Koreans and all them, and there's probably limited interaction between the Hebrews and those people. So that doesn't make it into the record. And I'm
Right.
not one of those people that believes if the Bible doesn't say it, it's not true.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of people that get into really stupid mental gymnastics. For example, in Christianity and Judaism, over the fact that like Cain, it says that Cain married his wife, and it's like, where did she come from? Because it
Right.
doesn't mention like where she came from, and they just get into a mess.
Gotcha. Yep.
And another interesting thing, though, however, you can go up to Torah.org or whatever. Torah, I'm assuming Torah.org is probably one of the biggest, easily accessible contemporary Jewish information websites. But they have articles of all sorts of stuff, from what modern Jews and what the worldview revolves around. But I read something that was pretty interesting to me. There was they say that the Table of Nations employs kinship language to illustrate political affiliations.
Okay.
And so certain things that appear to be genealogical might not actually be literally
Might
genealogical.
be more political.
Yeah, for example, yeah, and let's say archaeologically things like so let's say not the Table of Nations, I don't think it does this, but later on in Genesis, in the days of Abraham, it talks about how the Hittites were the descendants of Heth, who was listed in the Table of Nations as a son of Ham.
Okay.
Well, I think archaeologically and like anthropologically, the DNA and cultural like evidence does not show that they're Afro-Semitic or Hamitic-Semitic peoples. They're a completely different people with a completely different language group. In fact, they're a language isolate, which means so you have like two ways generally of deciding if like how to connect people or see if there's a connection or if one group's descended from another. DNA evidence or like other cultural analysis like clothing or pottery or specifically language, honestly.
Okay.
And their language is considered isolated from any other known language group. It's like its own thing, the Hittite language. Besides the fact that they adopted the cuneiform
Okay.
script, right, that we talked about earlier.
Okay.
And Elam, which is listed as a son of Shem, uh, they're a Semitic people in southern Iran, but their language was completely different, a completely different language group. It was not a Semitic language. And we could attribute that to the Tower of Babel, which we're going to talk about too, maybe. I
Right.
don't know. These are just interesting things to me. Anyway, so you have political affiliations being described in kinship language, and so could it be that the Hittites weren't really Hamitic people, but they were affiliated with Egypt or Babylon or whatever? They were against the Hebrews, and therefore the Hebrews put them in a lineage language. They use language to describe them being opposed to or affiliated with Canaanites that they were fighting for their land, later that the Israelites were
So
fighting.
you're saying not so much even that these different tribes or peoples were actually aligned, but more or less were assigned
It could be.
that they were kind of lumped together by their opposition, so to speak,
They could
right?
have been that way. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Opposition or actual political alliances.
Okay.
Right.
Now let me ask you this. Is there any direct in just the one that you talked about there with Ham's descendants? Is there anything that we can see from like a group that we know was Ham's descendants and this other group? Do we know enough about their geopolitical dealings to make those connections to say, oh yeah, here, this looks like they're connected politically as opposed to genealogical, right?
I
Because
I would say I don't know that, but I would say without a shadow of a doubt that information probably exists to disprove that or not.
okay, all right. I was just curious. I was just throwing that out
So
there, wondering
I don't
if you
have
have found those connections anywhere.
there'd be something for me to look into, but I can't confirm it, but I would say that it seems that there's enough information on this point period of time regarding the Hittite Empire and the Assyrian Empire and other stuff that there probably is commentary on that.
Okay.
I would be very bold to say and confident to say that there's commentary on that.
All right. Cool.
But this also plays into other things, which is interesting too, because in Genesis you have language that conflates the Amorites, which are said to be. It says that before the Israelites came out of the Exodus, right, that the land of Canaan was inhabited by the Amorites and the Canaanites.
Right.
And it almost uses the terms interchangeably. Now, historically, we know that there was Amorite people and we know that there was Canaanite people. They weren't the same group of people, but the Bible makes it seem like they were the same.
Okay.
They were in the same land. And that might be true. Maybe there was two different groups of people there, but it seems to be more used interchangeably in the text. And there are some thoughts on that. For example, Amaru for Amorites was a descriptor used by the Assyrians for that same land of Palestine, and Canaan was a word used by the Egyptians for the same land.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so you could see how the Hebrews writing later would say, we're just going to use the words that our enemies used
Okay.
and attribute that to the people that lived here before.
Gotcha. Okay.
Right. So there's also some of that slush going on. But we would possibly run into some complications when you look at some things because, you know, if you were just to blanketly assume that Amorites were Canaanites, there's a poem or a song or a psalm or something to this day. It's not like in Psalms, but it's a let's see, I have it here somewhere. I think. Yeah, there's a poem that Jews recite that goes one of the refrains goes something like, "Our father was a wandering Syrian, an outcast, a tramp," but the word that they use for tramp is Amorite. So our father was a wandering Syrian, an outcast, an Amorite, and you brought him to this blessed land and gave him this, right? Meaning the promised land.
Mm-hmm.
They're singing to God, right? And so, but Abraham was an Amorite. He was from Babylon,
Okay.
right? And so, but we see his lineage and we know he's not from Ham,
Interesting.
right? Even though the Bible says the Amorites or equates them with the Canaanites.
So you would think that this would be more of a political alliance.
Mm-hmm.
But again, nothing you've seen that actually connects that political alliance, but it's out there.
It's out there, and there's
Okay.
commentary, yeah, on these thoughts. But we know that the Amorites they weren't the original Babylonian dynasty, but they took over the Babylonian Empire at one point, and they were in control of the Babylonian Empire.
Gotcha. Okay.
But Abraham leaves, and so this goes into so in the Table of Nations we get I think it starts out with the lineage of Japheth, and it gives all the sons of Japheth, and then it gives all the sons of Ham and their nations. And then it gives the sons of Shem, and it goes from Shem down to Eber, and it goes to his son Joktan,
Okay.
and it gives like seven sons. And then in the next chapter, it gives the genealogy of Shem again, but it goes a different line.
Mm,
And instead of going through Joktan, it goes through his brother Peleg, who people probably know. That says that in the days of Peleg was the earth divided.
right.
And then through Peleg, it gives more generations, and that goes to Abraham. And so some scholars have said that the reason behind why two genealogies are presented, one going through Joktan and one through Peleg, is because the genealogy through Joktan is the ones that stayed in Babylon and helped form that empire, and is
Mm,
probably, I'm guessing, associated with Nimrod.
okay.
And the other genealogy, or Abraham, was the one that left.
Gotcha. Okay.
Terah took his family, and they went to Syria, and so that lines up with how they're calling him an Amorite and a Syrian. And Paddan Aram, where Laban and Rebekah and Rachel and
I
Terah
see.
Terah died. They died. He died in Paddan Aram, which is in Syria,
Gotcha. Okay.
right?
That makes sense. So there's some connections too, and if I'm skipping ahead, let me know.
No, you're good, bud. You're good.
There's some connections that um link the god Baal with Nimrod, right?
Yeah, we can go back to that. That was yeah, you remember that. We had our lesson. So yeah, there was in the days of early Christianity, right? The claims for the Armenian nation, and I'm a big fan of the Armenians after the stuff we've done because they have all
Hmm.
the best early Christian stuff.
Right.
They claim to be the first nation converted to Christianity
Okay.
as a nation. And so there was a bishop in Armenia who was asked by one of the rulers of the kingdom to compile a national history. Well, this bishop was one of the main guys that translated the scriptures from Greek into the Armenian language at the time. This is 474 AD
Okay.
is when he compiled their history as a nation.
So pretty recent.
Yeah.
I
Pretty
mean, I mean, from the time of Christ, pretty recent.
right. And this bishop said, in their history, he recorded that they were of the Armenians were of the Japheth side of the family,
Okay.
and that they had a legend that after the flood, they moved down into what would be Babylon for a while, and that there was a wicked giant named Bel, and that Bel wanted them to submit and capitulate, and they wouldn't, and so they moved north again, and Bel waged a war against them, and they fought a war. And other nations got involved, and there was a big war until Bel was slain. Well, Bel is the west, I think. Hold on, let me find that. Bel is the East Semitic language cognate for Baal or Baal
Right.
that we read in the scriptures, right? So you have back to language groups. You have like the West Semitic languages and East Semitic languages, and Hebrew's East Semitic, or no, West. But so a cognate is a word that sounds a lot like another word in a different language.
Right.
And so sometimes you have false cognates. For example, I remember being warned about that when I had high school Spanish classes. That's a false cognate. Like what's that word? Sounds like pregnant, but it means embarrassed in Spanish.
Interesting.
You know,
Okay.
but it doesn't mean you're pregnant, like you're
Right.
carrying a child. It just means you're embarrassed, but it's a false cognate.
Okay.
But there's true cognates too. And so Bel and Baal are the West and East Semitic versions, right? And that just means Lord. For example, Bel was uh, generally used as the descriptor or title as of Lord for the Babylonian god Marduk was the proper name, and Baal was the descriptor for Lord or Master used for the Syrian or Babylonian god Hadad,
Okay.
and also Hittite. He was a Hittite god as well, Hadad. So
So,
Baal Hadad would be the full way you'd say it.
sure. So there there was a time when, for whatever reason, I kept drawn back into looking at Baal or Baal, right? Either or. And I found this connection interesting because if that's the case, if Nimrod is Baal, we can find out a little bit more about it
Yes, we could.
because um, that was a nasty cult, right?
Straight up.
That was a very nasty cult. And one of the things I remember reading on this, and it made such a deep impression on me at this time about it, was um during during the Punic Wars. I think it was the Punic Wars, where Carthage went to war with Rome.
Yep, that's the Punic Wars.
Um, the final war when Rome sacks Carthage and like salts the ground. There's backstory there that we don't get
Okay.
normally, right? You got to dig for it a little bit. But the general who did that, his name was Scipio.
Hmm.
Now, this is when Rome is starting to become Rome, right? This is when they're just entering their nation building phase, their empire building phase.
Hmm.
They send Scipio over there and they said, "We've had enough, right? Hannibal's been here. We're done. Finish this." So they send him over. Now, Rome isn't exactly known as the um, banner of moral um, uprightness, right?
Yeah.
They're shady themselves, right? But Scipio gets into Carthage, and he does something that's odd for Rome. Now, Rome, although they're not moral, they're pragmatists, right?
Hmm.
Pragmatic in how they build their empire.
Sure.
And by and large, you're like, look, pay your taxes. You don't become a pain in the ass. We're going to let you do what you want to do. You can worship your gods.
Yeah.
You can
Sure.
keep your language. It's really kind of smart if you're into empire building, right? Because, we're going to have a governor here, but really, if you're not a problem, you're not even going to see him.
Right.
He's going to hang out in that palace. He doesn't even want to be around you guys. He's just here because it's a step up.
Right.
They don't do that with Carthage.
No. Good.
They go in and they level it. They
Uh-huh.
salt the ground. And everybody thinks, well, that's because they tried to attack Rome. That's not necessarily the truth. The truth is, Scipio finds all sorts of nasty child sacrifice.
Hmm.
And who are they sacrificing to?
Baal.
Baal. And it's so bad that Scipio goes, nothing will grow here again. Wipe it out. Be done with it. So my contention is this. If Scipio marches into Carthage and he's a Roman and he goes, you guys are straight and moral,
There's a
there's
problem.
some problems, right? Now, if that's the case, then there's some echoes back to who Nimrod was, if Nimrod is Baal.
That's a good point. I know I've heard, that for 100 years or so, every Senate meeting in Rome in the Republican era was ended with a declaration. As they were conducting business, the last item every meeting of the Senate for like 100 years or more was, and we will destroy Carthage.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Like it made an impression, right?
Yeah.
Like just think about it, right? We get hit at 9/11, and it's not like death to Muslims after every Congress, right? I mean, so there was some stuff going on there that was flat horrific
So
that they didn't want to see.
I don't have any scholarly things to back this up, but the Bible kind of hints at this. But I read something somewhere, I can't remember, that really put it into good terms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is very heavy
Sure.
to the point that you're bringing up. But again, the Bible does hint at this. There was, when you read the Old Testament, there's problems repeatedly with what are called, I don't think it uses the word licentious, but there's rites and ceremonies that
Mm-hmm.
are licentious, meaning there was cultures like this culture in Carthage or other places. It was a problem that Israel had from time to time because it was so seductive, and that's why the penalties were death.
Mm-hmm.
And it happened in Moses' day, even when they were traveling in the wilderness. There was temple prostitutes,
You're right.
right? And human sacrifice was born out of the perversion, perhaps, of the idea of the atoning sacrifice of the Savior, because it was expected in these ancient cultures that had this corrupt view of this, that you were to offer your firstborn son as a sacrifice. Like every family was to offer your firstborn son as a sacrifice. Well, that evolved into temple prostitution because the male then would go to the temple and then they would all be with the same female, and then collectively the blood of their collective son would be sacrificed. And so
Right.
that is the sacrifice of the nation collectively, right? Of
Right.
the temple prostitutes' children,
Yeah.
you know, because she's symbolically taken on, the seed of all the men.
Yep. Yep. There's also and now you're about to find out why I'm popular at parties. Um, so I've been sworn to secrecy to tell you who it was from. But there was someone who enlightened me into what happened right before Jeremiah starts Lamentations.
Okay,
And it has some stuff to do with Baal,
sure.
right? And typically what would happen is that if your country was experiencing a drought and you were flirting with Baal, or let's say you had bad crops one year, and your country was flirting with the idea of, well, gosh, maybe we should go talk to Baal about this and his priests, right?
Sure.
Baal, the priest would say, well, let's start with this, right? And Baal was the god of commerce, weather, and
Fertility.
fertility.
Yep.
They'd say, do this. Okay, first things first, you need to make an offering to Baal. So this is what I need you to do. I need you to take a portion of your land that you're using to grow crops, and I want you to turn it back wild, feral, right?
Right.
Let it go. That's an offering back to Baal, God and nature. Well, let's just say that the drought got worse next year, right? Let's say it's a full blown drought. You go back to the priest of Baal, and he would be like, yeah, it didn't work. You're gonna have to up your game. So now it's time for ritualistic orgies.
Mm.
Put the kids to bed for this, or put earmuffs on them.
Sure.
So there'd be real ritualistic orgies. Well, let's just say in a country like Israel, how important is your lineage back to your patriarchal line?
Incredibly important.
It's incredibly important. And so basically the only thing that happened in these ritualistic orgies, the one thing that was off limits, the only thing that was off limits, you couldn't be with your spouse. Well, what happens when you do that?
The children don't know who their father is.
Right. And the father doesn't know who their child is.
Right.
Now, let's say that next season, things get even worse, and you go back to the priest of Baal one more time. And the priest will say, yeah, you're going to have to sacrifice a kid. And so they would sacrifice those children that were conceived
In the orgies.
in the orgies. This gentleman, that's all I'll say because I've sworn to secrecy, right? But he's a guy who would know. That's all I'm going to say, right? Nothing mystical, nothing from anybody of that time, just somebody with some knowledge. Said we're still practicing the religion of Baal today.
Right.
And I'm like, shut up.
Just under different names.
Shut up. And I'll tell you what he told me, and it made my blood run cold. And this was my LDS days, right? This was before I was like, yeah, plural wives sound great. Um, and that was he said, what do we have today in the environmental movement? To congregate all these people into one area and then let the ground go feral, right? If you look at it used to be called Agenda 21, I think.
2030.
20 now it's 2030. It used to be Agenda 20 or 21. I can't remember. Basically, the idea was we want all people to live inside these big metropolitan areas and we want to return the ground back to feral.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you do that. And then what's the other thing? Well, we live in it today that is a pretty promiscuous environment, right?
Yeah, the family is not a
Right.
staple of the cornerstone of civilization.
And what comes out of a promiscuous society? Unwanted pregnancies.
Which lead to abortions.
And I'll never forget this. This man from his leather chair just kind of leaned in real close and he goes, the priests of Baal are alive and well today. It's just they've traded in their red robes for white lab coats.
Right.
And we're still practicing Baalism today, only it's been repackaged for modern consumption.
Yep.
And that made my blood run cold, very cold. And when we get into the Tower of Babel here, there's some other stuff he had to say about Nimrod that was very interesting. So, anyway, and that's why people like to have me over at their parties.
That's right. All right, so Nimrod. Nibley says that he inherited through his grandfather Ham the garment provided for Adam when he left the Garden of Eden, and he used this power associated with this garment to achieve his greatness. He arrogantly rebelled against God, claiming to be a god and wanting people to worship him. He instigated the building of the Tower of Babel and hunted food for the builders of it. There's also legends that he threw Abram or Abraham into a fiery furnace in an unsuccessful attempt to kill him after Abram refused to worship an idol, and he initiated the worship of fire and of the stars. None of these traditions, however, is attested to in the Bible or the other sources from the time of the Old Testament. And hold on, we'll get to that point maybe. Hold on. He became arrogant and said that he was a god, and the men of his time served and bowed themselves to him. This king was a schemer and a sage, and he saw in the wisdom of the stars that a man would be born in the south who would stand up against him and wrestle him from his faith and defeat him. Traditions relate how, after consulting his advisors, Nimrod determined to slay the newborn males uh, to eliminate his future rival Abraham. The scene recalls Pharaoh's attempt to halt the birth of male Israelites at the time of Moses, and King Herod's slaying of young children in Bethlehem. Such stories are consistent with Nimrod's reputation for cruelty. He is said to have been the first to enact crucifixion and mutilation as punishments.
Whew.
But Bar Harbra he pardon me. Bar Hebraeus recounts that Nimrod was killed when the tower was overturned, recalling the death of the priests of Elkanah when the Lord broke down the altar on which the young Abraham was to be sacrificed.
Mhm.
Nibley also says in Genesis 10:4, we read that Nimrod, the mighty hunter against the Lord, founded the kingdom of Babel, and in the next chapter that Babel was the name of the tower built to reach heaven. This Nimrod seems to be the original archetype of the mad hunter. His name is for the Jews at all times the very symbol of rebellion against God and of usurped authority. He it was who became the hunter of men and established a false priesthood and a false kingship in the earth in imitation of God's rule and made all men to sin. A very, very early Christian writing tells how Noah's descendants waged bitter war against among themselves after his death to see who would possess Noah's kingship. From the race of Ham, says the text, came one whom through the magical, as opposed to the holy, succession, whose name was Nimrod, who was a giant against the Lord, forcing all men by his false magical arts to recognize his authority. The Chronicon Paschal reports a widespread tradition that this giant who built Babylon was more wicked than all men who were before him. The antiquity of these stories may be judged from an early Babylonian account of a wicked king who caused them to sin, earning for himself the title King of a Noble Mound and God of Lawlessness, or a God of no government. In the very earliest Indo-European traditions, this person is the man of the lie and the king of the mad men, who sat on a throne for 1,000 years and forced all men to subscribe their names in a book of the dragon, thus making them subject to him. This recalls a very ancient tradition that when Seth succeeded Adam in the priesthood, he ordered a special record be kept, in which was called the Book of Life, and which was concealed from the sons of Cain. This dragon's book was an imitation of this, and there is a constant tendency in ancient records to confuse the founder of earthly kingship and the father of the human race, not with Adam, but with a false Adam or usurper.
Wow.
Yeah, will lead us into the next subject, but if you have comments, go
No,
for it.
I think there's some echoes there, right? Where it talks about killing the firstborn since it's Abraham's rival, right? I think
Yeah, it's fair.
I think that there's some stuff there that definitely have some echoes back to this, right? Um, and look, if Nimrod set himself up to be a counterfeit Christ, right, Lord, um,
Sure.
the idea that he would come back at some point,
Well,
we'd have to think that would be a legit connection, so to speak, right? A legit connection in the sense of it would point to his usurpation of that title of Christ.
well, no, and he did. I mean, if what the Armenians said in their history is true, if Bel or Baal is equivalent with the historical Nimrod or they're associated somehow, Marduk's the real name, right? Do you know anything about Marduk?
I
Because
don't.
Bel's just the descriptor, right? The Babylonian god Marduk is the savior figure in the Babylonian mythology.
Okay. All right.
He's one of the sons of the Most High God, which I think was um there's other ones that are higher. There's Ea, who we learned that He was the one that spoke to Noah, or the Babylonian equivalent of Noah.
Gilgamesh.
In Not Gilgamesh, his name was Utnapishtim, right?
Okay.
He's the one that took the tower, or not the tower, the the temple that was built of reeds,
Oh yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
he spoke. Ea spoke to him through the veil, and told
Yep.
him to deconstruct the building and build the ark, which was a cube, right? So Ea, I don't think Ea was Marduk's father, but Ea, I think they were brothers, Marduk and Ea. And Marduk is the one that in this cosmological battle before the Earth was created, the war in heaven, right?
Right.
Their version of the war in heaven. There is a monster named Tiamat, and she is a threat to the gods. And she's very scary, and none of the gods feel like they can fight her. And Marduk says, I'll do it, and I'll go slay the dragon. I'll go slay Tiamat, and I will do it if I get the signs and the emblems of the Most High God to, you know, take
Interesting.
the birthright position, right? Who does that sound like, first of all?
To slay the dragon.
Well, not just to slay the dragon, but I will do it. Therefore, give me thine
It
honor.
sounds like Lucifer.
Yeah, well, he does, and he goes and slays the dragon and or Tiamat, and he builds the earth on her corpse.
Okay. It's almost like they're telling the exact same story, only from the other point of view and with some wishful thinking.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so Bel or Baal and Marduk are
Are the
the
same
same,
person.
right?
Yeah.
And Nimrod, presumably. So this is the religion that we're looking into.
Okay.
Presumably, maybe, maybe we're onto something there.
Right.
I can't say for sure, but it's interesting. Nibley continues in other places. He says, in Abraham's time, it was terribly bad. Remember, it says that there was a famine in the land and they moved on. They could not settle in Canaan. They had to move on into Egypt. The reason they went into Egypt was because there was corn in Egypt, and the only place they could buy corn was there, and that's why Jacob sent his sons into Egypt later. There was a terrible time of drought, the whole period. We have the lamentation from this time. When he says that, I'm assuming we have historical documentation that there's
Right.
massive, prolonged famine. When the Nile failed to rise, since Egypt was the only place to find grain, and if they didn't have any in Egypt, you were hard up. But this is the world of Abraham. They have to make sacrifice. They have to do something about it, and they do. Abraham goes up, and he is to be offered. The whole theme of the Abraham story in the Book of Abraham is a rivalry between Abraham and Pharaoh as to the priesthood and kingship. So I'm going to have my own commentary in here. This is what we're seeing, right? With these
Right.
other stories is with Nimrod and Abraham, with Nimrod taking the garment from Ham, with Ham taking the garment from Noah, and Nimrod in these stories of throwing Abraham in the fiery furnace. It's a combat for the priesthood.
Right.
Okay. I just want to put that commentary there. So he continuing, Nibley says, that's why Pharaoh, we are told in the Midrash, wanted to marry Sarah to raise up a righteous line, which is what Abraham wanted to do. So he took Sarah away because she was the princess. He was to raise up a line, but there's a constant conflict between the two. As you notice in the first part, Abraham is sacrificed on the altar in the place of Pharaoh, which was considered a great honor at this time, which he goes to explain. There was something called the Sed Festival back in these days. The Sed Festival was if a pharaoh was to reign for over 30 years, every year they would do a Sed Festival because at that point you were presumably old.
Okay.
So it was only for older pharaohs. And it was to symbolize the rejuvenation and the resurrection of the pharaoh as the son of God,
Okay.
and reigning for eternity, right? So the Sed Festival was a celebration originally at the end of 30 years when the king started to get old and feeble. The king had to be sacrificed, and then he would be restored, quote unquote, in his son Horus, which has their mythology about
Right.
Osiris and Horus, right? Who would be regarded as the resurrected version of the king. The pharaoh would disappear for 3 days, and suddenly he would come out as Horus, or as himself. It's the same idea. It was convenient also to come forth without being put to death. That way, but you would just disappear for a while and then come forth. and have somebody else put to death in your place. So you have a sacrifice. You have a proxy, which is done. The rules are very strict and they were followed here. There are a great many instances of this happening. And so Nibley's contention is that Abraham was chosen as a substitute for
Oh,
the
okay.
said festival for one of the pharaohs, right? He says Abraham was chosen, and I say it was considered a great honor, probably not by Abraham, but
Probably not. No.
by generally it was considered. You know,
Well,
the Egyptians like, oh yes, such a great honor, you're going to be sacrificed because you get to sit on Pharaoh's throne
right,
and you're dressed up as Pharaoh.
right.
Yeah,
Well, I think this also is a good time to say it's important to know what parties you're going to.
that's so true.
Right,
But Nibley says you had to be a noble,
right.
which is interesting because that means Abraham was of noble lineage, and you had to be a stranger, so you're not Egyptian, and you had to have either yellow or red hair
Interesting. Okay.
because that's a symbol of the
Right.
birthright.
Yep.
Yeah. They preferred red hair to anything else, he says. So you were in real danger if you visited Egypt and you were a redhead. Those are Nibley's words, not mine. It says in the Book of Abraham, now at this time it was the custom of the priest of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to offer upon the altar which was built in the land of Chaldea, for the offering unto these strange gods, men, women, and children. He says, well, what was the Egyptian king doing in Chaldea? Because Chaldea was Babylon.
Right.
You know, when you see in the Old Testament when it says the Chaldeans, that's a term for Babylonians. In the 18th dynasty, there was Ramses II. What was he doing up there at Megiddo, which is Israel, right? That's the Valley of Armageddon. Well, he conquered that. That was Egyptian country in those days. That's where this was, Chaldea. It was a temporary time. At the time Abraham wrote this, or at the time that his children were supposed to read it, apparently, it was no longer a part of the Egyptian empire. It came and it went. In the 18th dynasty, Thutmose III took the whole shebang clear over to the Euphrates. Then they lost it all. Then they got it back again in the 20th dynasty. Then finally, in the 22nd dynasty, the great pharaoh Sheshonq went out and conquered it all again, and even more. Then it was lost again. And then Alexander the Great took the name of Sheshonq and went and oh, sorry, and said that he was the son of Amun, which is the
Right.
most high god in the
Yep.
Egyptians, right? He said that he was the son of Amun and made himself pharaoh, and he went back and conquered the whole thing again and followed the very same pattern. Each of these conquerors called himself a cosmocrator. The story of a cosmocrator is important because Abraham's rival, Pharaoh, always called himself a cosmocrator. You know what that would be. The cosmos is the universe, and the crater is a person who rules. It's a Greek title. The cosmocrator was the man who claimed to rule the world as God's successor on earth. The mortal rival of Abraham was a cosmocrator who went by the name of Nimrod. All the legends say that Pharaoh who tried to sacrifice Abraham was this Nimrod.
Interesting.
You know Nimrod, the mighty hunter of the Bible. Is it the same one? That's a long story, so we won't go into it. I so wish he'd go into it.
I know. I wish you would too.
But the point is that Abraham in the legends has a mortal rivalry with the person who claims to have the priesthood and the kingship. Does he have the right to rule? And does he have the priestly right? Well, that's what Abraham had, and that's what Pharaoh or Nimrod coveted. And Pharaoh didn't have to sacrifice Abraham anymore because the sacrifice had already been made. The high priest was the substitute when he died, when the altar was destroyed, as we read in the book of
Right.
Abraham, right?
Yep.
The angel comes and saves him, and the priest dies. So
Right.
you have the substitute. Now that someone had been sacrificed, he had no argument with Abraham, and he did honor Abraham by letting him sit on his throne. The Pharaoh had ordered the people all to bring cedar wood and make an enormous bonfire to burn Abraham on. Then the priest's knife was cast from his hand, and the priest was overthrown and killed, and Abraham was let go. Then he ordered them to gather wood and build a special place to put Abraham's throne on. Then he said he had 365 of the highest nobles of the land come with their children to Abraham to sit on the throne and be taught the principles of astronomy by Abraham. So Nibley's taking other sources and using these to illustrate
Interesting.
what our pearl of great price in the Book of Abraham says, that this is well attested to.
Hmm.
The sacrifice motif and
Right.
him teaching astronomy and our Joseph Smith's facsimiles interpret that image as Abraham sitting on Pharaoh's throne,
Yeah.
and that's there too.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah,
Woo. Still a pretty good guesser.
still a pretty good guesser. When Abraham was miraculously delivered from the altar, the Pharaoh, who was Nimrod over there too, says, I recognize your God. I want to make a sacrifice to him. I want to sacrifice 4,000 oxen to him. And it's an embarrassing situation. Abraham says, I'm glad you do recognize him, but you can't do that. You don't have the priesthood. You're not authorized to do that. You're blessed as to the kingship, but cursed as to the priesthood. Now, Pharaoh, being of that lineage which was by which he cannot have the right of the priesthood, notice it was his lineage to blame, notwithstanding the Pharaohs would fain claim it from Noah through Ham. Pharaoh, being a righteous man, established his kingdom and judged his people wisely and justly all his days, seeking earnestly to imitate the order established by the fathers in the first generations. Now, that's a very important word, imitate. You say, but look, did the Egyptians have the gospel? They have so many ordinances and things that resemble ours. Well, no, they didn't, but they had a darn good imitation. So if you want to know what the original was like, this is the best chance you have of studying this because the imitation was a good one. But he knew he didn't have it. I have a section in that book on Abraham and Egypt where there are many texts in which Pharaoh is fretted and worried and doubts his own authority. He is seeking earnestly to imitate the patriarchal order of the first generations. He couldn't have it because he came through the wrong line, it says. Through Ham, well, Ham, we are told, was a righteous man and walked with God too, but it was through the line of Cush and Nimrod. They rebelled and left the priesthood. It's a famous story of the stolen garment. I could go on.
Hmm.
So, Nibley is kind of hard to follow sometimes on
Right.
certain things. I want to say I don't think he's equating Nimrod and Pharaoh in our Book of Abraham as the same being.
Right.
For one, our Book of Abraham says Pharaoh was actually a righteous man.
Right.
And to all other evidence, Nimrod was probably not.
Right.
But he is saying that in other Jewish and other texts, the same story practically exists. In some versions, it's Nimrod. In some versions, it's Pharaoh.
Gotcha.
And the
Okay.
motifs are shared between the two. And the main problem, the main idea is there's a rivalry between the
Gotcha.
true priesthood and the imitator.
Gotcha. Okay.
And in some stories, it's Nimrod, some it's Pharaoh.
Gotcha.
In our Book of Abraham, it happens to be Pharaoh, who, and in my mind, this probably comes after Nimrod, but that doesn't say. Well, I'll put my 2 cents out there. The story was probably the same with Nimrod, but I bet you the Nimrod was the imitator to Melchizedek.
Okay. That makes sense.
So it's
That
the
makes
same
sense.
story, different characters,
Yeah.
separated by probably about 200 years or so.
Okay. That makes
That
sense.
would be my thoughts.
Yep, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And so
Ooh.
the one of the stories, for example, has Abraham's father was a priest
Right.
in the court of Nimrod. But the sages, the shamans who would read the stars, saw omens in the sky that a child would be born that would overthrow Nimrod, right? So that's when he had all the children killed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's when Terah, who has this young boy, Abraham's like, to hell with you, you're not slaying my son. And that's when he leaves. That's why they leave.
That's why they go to Ur. Yeah.
Is because Terah, despite being an idolater,
Had his bounds.
yeah, he was not willing to have his son Abraham killed,
Right.
you know.
Whew. I was just speaking to someone on another podcast about this. What we have today in society is an aberration, right?
Yeah, so much. I don't
I
know where you're
mean,
going with this, but I can already just agree that yes, it
yeah,
is an
it's an
aberration.
aberration, right? The bulk of human history up until about the last 200 years is a bloody one.
That's so bloody.
And I mean, can you imagine having to smuggle your kid out because
The king wants him dead all of a
yeah,
sudden. Yeah.
yeah, just out of nowhere. Ugh,
Yeah, he's just gonna listen to these drug-induced hippies that say they see signs in the stars.
right. Mm.
Yeah, forget that.
Yeah, it's rough stuff. Phew. Okay.
And so, yeah, what I'm saying is Abraham probably did have interactions with both Nimrod and this other pharaoh.
I think so. I think so.
Maybe not directly with Nimrod, but like his origin story is dependent on Nimrod's
Oh
madness.
yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, 100%, right? And we could see where Terra would be useful to Nimrod, right? I mean, if he's an idol maker,
Hmm.
I mean, I could see where that would come into play.
Yep. And that's what the early Christian literature and the Islamic literature says is that Terah was a he made idols and sold them, and Abraham's origin story is that he used a little bit of reason to decide why should I worship these, right? And
Right.
and there's that whole story about he smashed all the idols in the shop and then put like a hammer
Right.
or an axe in the hand of the biggest one to kind of show his dad how silly this all was,
Yep.
and to say, well, I didn't do it. You're this guy, the big god, did it, and Tara has to admit, of course he didn't do it. It's not alive,
Right.
you know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. uh,
But he still wouldn't convert, right? It's so interesting, at least according to the stories.
right. You ever wonder where Abraham gets the idea that this is something I've wondered about, right? Because he's raised in a very idolatrous society.
Yep.
I can't imagine there was a whole lot of talk going on about the order of the fathers, right? I would like to know where Abraham comes up with this idea.
Well, by the time our Book of Abraham, by the time he commences writing the Book of Abraham, he has the records of the fathers and he has the Urim and Thummim.
Yeah, but where'd you get those?
I would assume from Melchizedek.
Okay.
I would assume.
Okay. Yeah.
That's my guess. I mean, the other literature that we've gone through, the primary and secondary Adam literature and the Enochian literature, seems to indicate that there's a consistent line of transmission of the records from Adam through Seth to Enoch, through Noah to Shem.
Okay. Yeah.
And so if Shem is Melchizedek, then that would make sense that Abraham would get him from Shem.
But again, you know, how does Shem and Melchizedek come together?
That's the question, and then maybe they're the same, maybe they're not.
Interesting.
You want to take a break for a second?
No, we can do that. Okay, I'm ready when you are.
I'm ready.
Okay. All right, so after that, where do we go?
We're gonna talk about the Great Tower, Tower of Babel, in a minute. But yeah, just to finish and round out Abraham and Pharaoh, um, Nibley points out that the stories in the whether it's Midrash or Talmud or Targums or whatever the Hebrew literature is, they seem to indicate that Pharaoh and Abraham parted on good terms. But the reason why they had to part, like Pharaoh kind of forced Abraham out of Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
because of that priesthood rivalry. Because you can't have, because there's the rivalry between the kingship and the priesthood, and you can't have two kings in Egypt.
Right.
And you can't, and if Abraham had the priesthood, then Pharaoh would have to be subservient, right?
Right.
I can't have that, but you can leave and take all this stuff. And that's where Hagar comes in, maybe,
Right.
and
Yeah.
giving gifts and leave in peace. Sorry for what
Right.
happened here,
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
a thing. I mean,
Yep.
that's after, well, that'd be maybe after the second time he entered Egypt because he goes to Egypt again because he's offered in Chaldea, right?
Right.
So that's a second trip. Anyways, so that rounds out kind of the story between Abraham and Pharaoh that is encapsulating the idea that there's this rivalry between the counterfeit of the gospel and the fullness of the gospel. So some scholars have pointed out a trend in Genesis. In all these stories that we've covered, whether it's Adam and Eve, Enoch, or Noah, and this Tower of Babel that we're going to get into, they demonstrate a thesis that the first chapter of Genesis are characterized by a series of transgressions of boundaries that have been set up to separate mankind from the dwelling place of divinity.
Mm.
Therefore, it should be no surprise that the same stress on a borderline between the divine and human spheres is found in the passage on the Tower of Babel, which presents a tower whose top assaults the sky, a perfect and natural metaphor for the human assault on the divinely ordained cosmos.
Interesting.
Now, I'm not the one who particularly believes the tower was literally meant to reach into heaven.
Right.
I'm actually one, if you were to ask me, I think it was all symbolic. I think it was an imitation temple.
Okay.
There are commentaries from some people. There's an attributed statement from Joseph Smith. I'll even read maybe right now if I can find it. And again, he's working off of the details that he had,
Mm-hmm.
by the way. And what he has was Josephus, the
Okay. Yep.
Antiquities of the Jews. But this comes from George Lobb's journal, and there's no other accounts of this. Uh, the date that George Lobb attributes this to, any other dates in anyone else's journal, there's no commentary on from Joseph Smith on the same subject. But I will read it anyways, if I can find it. Joseph Smith allegedly says, Now in the days of Noah there was a man with the name of Nimrod. After the flood, God commanded the people to spread over the earth, but they would not, and stayed upon the land for fear of another deluge, or flood. Nimrod rose up and said that he could withstand God. He said, Come, let us build a tower here that the water can rise, and I will go up and I will fight this God. This is the account that Josephus tells us.
Hmm.
That's what Joseph says. But God confounded their language, and they were obliged to scatter abroad all over the land. Now I will tell the designs of the building of the Tower of Babel. It was designed to go to the city of Enoch, for the veil was not yet so thick that it hid it from their sight. So they concluded to go to the city of Enoch, for God gave him place above this impure earth, so he could breathe pure air. And his city, and he and his city were taken, for God provided a better place for him. For they were pure in heart, for it is this pure heart that causes Zion to be. And the time will come again to meet that Enoch and his city, and they will come again to meet our city, and his people will meet our people, and the air will be pure before the Lord, and he will be in our midst forever. So that's one view. And I've heard that view from people in the LDS worldview that they were building the
Right.
tower to get to the city of Enoch, which was in orbit.
I've also heard it said that the tower was made to be a safety place
That's what
from another deluge, right?
Josephus says that for sure, and I believe he says it was, if it wasn't him, it was another one, but he says, or they say that, yeah, it was made of brick and mortared to be made watertight, so
Right.
that and high enough that the flood could um, overcome it. But the brick was so that if the world was destroyed by fire, it would also withstand being baked,
Wow.
right?
Is
And so it was a contingency plan against two natural disasters. But Nibley in other places, I don't have the citations. He says, according to the Book of Ether, which we do have, in the Book of Ether, it says, in those days that the wind did never cease to blow. Right when the Jaredites were leaving,
mm-hmm.
they were on the waters for 344 days. And it says the winds did never cease to blow.
Gotcha.
Nibley says, that's a long time for the winds to never stop blowing.
Right.
And if that was happening on the land as well as on the sea, then that might have been what toppled the tower.
Right. You know, I keep getting drawn back to this story of the Tower of Babel. And there's so many things I have gleaned from the story that I think we in our modern day society need to take away. Um, One is unity, right?
Mm-hmm.
As Mormons, we can't wait for Zion, right? And when we say, okay, what is Zion? Well, Zion's a place where the people are of one heart and one mind, right? Unity.
Yep.
God has said that um that if you're not one, you're not mine.
Yep.
But something interesting happens in around this time, right? And I'm gonna just pull this up real quick. I believe it is Genesis 11 that this comes out of. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Let us go down there and confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. I am not a believer in unity at all costs,
Nor am I.
right? And I think what we see here in the Tower of Babel is what happens when you try to be united on false principles,
It's true.
right? Things get confounded. You start assigning different meanings to different things.
Like globalism could do.
Yeah, yeah, and in fact, that's where I'll go next, right? Let me pull this up. This actually comes from, go down here and look at this guy's name, Michael Laitman. He's a PhD in philosophy and Kabbalah. Um, and he's got an MSc, which I'm not sure what that is. This guy says this, and I find this very, very interesting. Uh, the B'nai Barak Research Institute is where this guy's out of. And he says this: in a spiritual sense, the Tower of Babel is an egotistic elevation of corporeal life where we wish to live according to love your neighbor, but based on egoism. That is the main mistake. The idea of not needing the Creator's help for the mutual construction of a a well-connected society. That people think they can achieve and sustain unity on their own. In principle, the construction of the Tower of Babel was by and large at the heart of communism and various revolutions. The idea of peace to huts, war to places, that the populace would manage on its own. And so there's also some interesting parallels that I've read from certain Jewish scholars that most of the time when Jews build something, they build it out of hewn stone,
Okay.
right? And for whatever reason, if we read the story goes in a weird order, right? It doesn't say, let's build a tower, so let's gather the materials, right? It's, let us make bricks. Now, bricks are a lot different than hewn stone.
That's true.
They're uniform.
Yeah, that's true. I get you.
They're uniform. They're exactly the same size.
Yeah, go talk to Pink Floyd, that whole song. You're just
Right.
another brick in the wall because they're all
Right.
the same. Yeah.
They're all the same, right? And so they make these bricks, right? And in these bricks is a symbol of being the same, right? It's essentially a work project is what it starts out with. So Nimrod's out there like, feed you, I'll give you work, right? What's that starting to sound like, right?
I know exactly what it's starting to sound like.
Okay. And so they start building this tower. Now there's other Jewish scholars who say, and I'll include these links in the show notes here. The other thing it says is that they were so concerned about the materialism of this thing that if somebody fell off the tower while they were building it, they wouldn't even stop. They just kept on going.
They were more worried about them dropping bricks than people.
Yes.
Yeah, Josephus says that.
100%. Right? And so there's this idea here that this may, according to some Jewish scholars, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I do find it fascinating that they're going to create a system at which they will avert natural or slash God's justice, right? That we can short the system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, and again, another reason why I'm super popular at parties. What we did after the financial collapse of 2008 is we built a tower. We said, never again will this happen to us. Very much similar to the Tower of Babel. Never again will we be flooded.
Mm-hmm.
Never again will we have the kind of economic collapse we did before. And we'll make sure this doesn't happen, right? The unfortunate thing is, or fortunate, I should say, is that the laws of economy are a lot like the laws of physics. At some point, they're going to be obeyed.
Right.
Right? And we have also built a kind of Tower of Babel, I think, with tech,
Yes.
right? Where we have substituted um, real life human interactions with this electronic Tower of Babel.
Hmm.
Now, I find it interesting that the one place God despises unity is in this story.
Yeah. I would say also we're creating currently a multicultural um, Tower of Babel,
Kind of a globalist kind of
the
thing.
globalist thing, and you see in the name of diversity, you actually see the destruction of diversity
Yes.
because,
Yes.
and that's very interesting, and it leads to confounding of traditions of
Right.
distinct peoples, which also could be part of this confounding that they see.
Yes.
Because Jared says, "Pray unto the Lord, brother, pray unto the Lord that we might not misunderstand our words," which is
Yes.
interesting. How does that happen that we couldn't understand our words? Well, I have an anecdote for that. It's really interesting.
Okay.
Back when Drew Briney lived here,
Hmm.
he was speaking in Sacrament. I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this.
We'll just say shout out to Drew. He can't be mad at
Shout
that.
out to Drew because this stuck with me, man. This stuck with me. He got up there and it was a darn good talk, and he says, "I am convinced that part of the Tower of Babel was slang.
Really.
That the younger generation, because of all the different groups coming in and the exchanging of words and slang words and the development, that the older generation couldn't understand the younger and vice versa because." For example, let's say even we don't have the longevity of the ancients, many
Right.
hundreds of years, but in two generations, we see certain things. Like back when I was a young teenager, when I would say dope, it means that's
Right.
cool, that's awesome. Back in the 80s with the Beastie Boys, it was that was ill, right? Whatever,
Right.
cool, right? My dad catches me saying that's dope. He says, "What do you mean that's dope? Dope's an idiot, you know."
Right.
And back in my day, dope was an idiot. And we started talking about that. And you know why they're idiots? Because they did dope.
Right.
They did, which was drugs,
Right. Yep.
which makes you stupid,
Yep.
right? And so you have connotation changes over time.
Yep.
And so we don't understand our words.
Yep. I think something else that's interesting is I don't think the Lord is necessarily looking for us to be cookie cutter either, right? I think that's the difference between hewn stone and bricks, right? Is that as we bring our diverse cultures together for something far better, which would be Zion, that's a strength, right? We see that when Moses is coming out of Egypt with everybody. In the scripture it says, and they were a mixed multitude as Israel's leaving, right?
Interesting.
So the Lord's giving a nod there, right? And so it becomes important that we each keep our various individuality, but at the same time keeping that individuality, we begin to become one in purpose, right? And I think that's where the strength really lies is when you can bring out those differences in people but have it united for one goal, right? Just as we'd say that the Father and the Son are different people,
But they're in union, right?
but they're in union,
Yeah, sure.
right? And so I think that's what we're looking for. And
That is what we're looking for.
as we look at Marxist theories on communism and whatnot, there was an idea that you would get past your individuality,
Yeah,
right?
you would. And you get into internationalism versus,
Well, and
yeah,
Marx says this only will work if you can get the whole globe on the system.
yeah.
Otherwise, it's going to fail, right? Likewise, there's even some teachings in communism that said you should stop referring to yourself as I and just start saying we.
So you've read 1984, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Do you remember where the main character is talking to one of the guys in the agencies, the Politburo or one of the others, in charge of language and education,
Yes.
and they are playing with the language of the people, and they're trying to break it down and
Yep.
dumb it down intentionally and narrow it down, even to the point he says that maybe one day All we'll ever have to say is one word that can mean anything
Yep.
for our communication.
Well, and what's interesting is in postmodernism now, right? What you're seeing a lot on universities is this idea that words don't have meanings,
Mhm. And
right?
when it doesn't have meaning, it's easier to be controlled by your government.
Absolutely. And so we're seeing this again play out, right?
Yeah.
Albeit we're not building physical towers,
Uh-huh.
but we absolutely are building towers with our economy, with our tech, and with our society,
Hmm.
right? And what I see in the Tower of Babel story is once again a twisting of a divine principle in Zion into something else.
100% is. And so the catch with Zion with Enoch, when we went over Enoch, was they were Zion because they were pure,
Right,
not just that they were with one heart and one mind. Because Babylon was one heart and one mind,
right,
but they were not pure.
right. Exactly. They were missing. There's a great song by Johnny Cash that he actually did with U2 called The Wanderer. And
Interesting.
in there, um, he has a great line. He says, I went into the capitals of tin and I sat on the park benches and I went to the churches and people talked about the kingdom, but they didn't want God in it.
Oh my word.
And I think that's what we saw here in the Tower of Babel. I think it's what we see in Babylon. I think it's what we see in modern day communist thought, right? Or postmodernism is this idea that no, 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 we're just the same, right? We see it with the sexes. We
Hmm.
see it between people. If we look at what the trend is now, what has typically been known as masculinity
Mm.
is different. The feminine is more masculine, and the masculine is more feminine,
That's true. That's exactly what's happened. It's
right?
become inverted.
And so what we've seen is this idea of just trying to make everything equal, or not even equal, the same, right? Um, and it goes, if you're not a God person, that goes against nature. If you are a God person, that goes against God's divine laws, right? And so this becomes extremely problematic. And I think that's why I keep getting drawn back to this story, because I think there's something here as a society we should take from this as a warning.
Isn't it interesting that this is like ancient wisdom, right? That's been written down for us. It's been spelled out right here.
Yeah,
How long have we had this story?
thousands of years.
2,000 plus years at least.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's applicable today
it's absolutely applicable today. It might be more literal today
than ever.
than ever.
I agree. I 100% agree.
So,
So there's also some secular thoughts on the Tower of Babel that I also find interesting. So when I present secular thoughts, I hope I don't come across as a secularist because I definitely believe in our religion. But there's multitudes of ways of looking at things that I think are helpful. Um, but a secular person looking at the Tower of Babel story, looking at the Bible, and looking at archaeology will point out that, for example, Shinar, which is the land that Nimrod started in, building his kingdom, refers to Mesopotamia, and the tower, he says, undoubtedly is the ziggurat, which was a man-made sacred mountain. And so it was like
hmm
a multiple tiered, squared, fortress looking thing that got narrower at the top, almost like a pyramid, but it wasn't sleek,
right.
right? And it had a staircase going up it. And actually, the main function of the bases of the buildings was just to support the staircases leading to the top. There's no other purpose besides having a
Interesting.
stairway to heaven.
Interesting.
And they say that it's interesting though because there's no records of any ceremonial rites performed in these ziggurats besides um like it wasn't the temple because there was other temples at the bases of the
hmm
ziggurats. And it seems that if anything was done there, that there was a play where the king of the nation would imitate the god, and he would sit on his throne at the top of the mountain, the sacred mountain, and he would walk down the stairs into the temple to
Interesting.
do the dramas, the ceremonies, the rites
Hmm.
in the temple at the base of the sacred mountain.
Interesting.
And So in a sense, these scholars would say, um, because they don't believe in a literal Tower of Babel, they would say that the Jews are putting in their mythology a critique against a what they saw in the nation that they came from.
Right.
They're criticizing the forms and fashions of Babylon, which they used to be a part of. That's where Abraham came from.
Right. No, it makes a lot of sense.
Hmm. Let's see what else we got. But yeah, to my earlier comment on the it being an imitation temple in Genesis 11, it says, besides let's go make brick, they say, go to, let us make brick, and we'll build a tower which reaches into heaven, and we will make a name for ourselves. And Nibley says that, and draws the parallels that this is, and names were sacred,
Yeah.
in Babylon in particular. If you knew someone's name, you had power over them.
Yep.
And so people would have multiple names that you'd go by, and you'd have
Right.
your own personal name that only your family would know about, for
Right.
example. And you'd go through initiation rites and you get new names or whatever. And so them going to build this tower to achieve a new name is very connected to temple worship and Latter-day Saint theology.
I've often wondered too, since Nimrod seems to be the leader of this twisted offshoot, I've often wondered if they weren't trying to abandon the name of Adam, right? No, no, no. We don't want to be sons of Adam or sons of Noah any longer. We'll be sons of Nimrod,
Sure.
right? Or sons of Baal,
Yep.
right? And we'll
Marduk or whoever.
we'll make ourselves a new name, right? And what the other thing I
So yeah,
find,
you're taking the form, but you're putting substitutions in.
right? The other thing I find interesting is they said name and not names. Again, going back to this unity idea under false pretenses, right? Was everybody going to be called
The same name.
the same name?
It's a good thought. I hadn't thought about that. But it's been pointed out, these, Lehi, for example, is leaving Jerusalem because of an apostate temple order in his day.
Right.
And he is shown in vision, his tree of life vision. He sees the symbol of this, the great and the spacious building, where all, which is high above the earth,
Right.
the tower imagery, and they're pointing at the church in the wilderness who are actually the ones seeking after the true path back to the tree of life.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
they're in revolt against the apostate temple. It's not just, when you go to Sunday school, the church, those are just Gentiles or those are prideful people. They don't want the gospel. No, it's those who had the building. They had Solomon's temple. They were in control. They were the ones with the priests in charge. They were obsessed about the fine clothing, and
Yep.
they were the ones persecuting the wanderers in the wilderness who were willing to go out in the desert and search for the tree of life, like the Dead Sea Scrolls people were later.
Right.
Right? It's the same motif.
Yep.
The Jaredites then are doing the same thing when the Jaredite colony leaves Babylon.
Right.
They're leaving an apostate temple order. Dave Butler says it's interesting that when, in our Book of Ether, it says that they go down out of the land into the land of Nimrod to leave. They leave the land of the tower. They go down. And he says that's interesting because it's consistent with idiomatic language in Hebrew thought that when you go to the temple, you always go up to the temple.
Yeah.
And when you leave the temple, you go down from the temple, or you go down from Jerusalem, or
Yep.
you go up to Jerusalem. That's
Yep.
just the way they speak. And so it's very consistent idiomatically that they are leaving
Hmm. Interesting.
by going down,
Yeah. That's
which is
fascinating.
the Akkadian word for um, that means gate of the god is Babili. So Babel,
Yep.
Babili, so there's another thing there that fits with the
I just
temple.
all of a sudden had an image of a Babylonian hillbilly. Um,
He talks about confounding of languages. I don't think we need to talk about that too much. Uh,
Funny how when we do these, we could end up covering half your stuff in just a conversation.
I know it's great though. It flows better that way. So, Melchizedek. Do we want to do that? Or do we want to do? Let's do Jaredites first,
Okay.
actually. The Jaredites. So, one thing that's interesting right from the get-go in the Book of Ether,
Mm-hmm.
we see Moroni's abridging this, and he says, "This is an abridgment by my hand of the Book of Ether, written who was the son of, who was the son of, who was the son of, who was the son of."
Right.
Right? It gives the genealogy. Well, this is an interesting test case for the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon that's perhaps overlooked. If we believe the testimonies regarding the translation process of the Book of Mormon,
Right.
we know Joseph Smith did not have notes,
Right.
and there was no opportunity for him to have notes or
Right.
to look at them. He goes and gives a long genealogical list of Ether's forebears, and then in reverse order supplies them as he supplements them with the details of their reigns to the end of the
Interesting.
book, right?
Right. And it matches up.
That, oh yeah, 100% matches up. So in reverse order, backwards from the first time he does it, right? So
Holy cow.
if he's making up all these names, Ether was the son of blah blah, who was the son, Coram, who was the son of Com, who was the son of Amnigada, who was the son of, Morianton, whatever.
So it lends
And then
itself
then he does it backwards.
so it lends itself to this idea that Joseph is reading
Really,
something rather than just
yeah,
pulling it out of thin air.
yeah, that he's not a really good guesser, right? But it's not just backwards. He then talks about all that happens in those reigns, right?
That's incredible.
Yeah, it is absolutely incredible.
Whew.
And so, and also in addition to that, the Book of Ether is the main theme throughout the narrative is showing a cycle of the fall and repentance, seeking and obtaining, or losing and reclaiming a kingdom,
Wow.
right?
Right.
All throughout it, we see king's getting old and one of the sons rebels. And
Right.
then the other son has to fight off the brother and then reclaim the kingdom, and then it happens all over again.
Hmm.
And it's just so interesting because this is actually the plan of salvation.
Right.
For example, the first king, so they ask for a king, and Jared convinces the brother of Jared to allow them to have a king, and the first king goes off without a hitch, but it's his son gets old, and then one of the brothers rebels. And then one of the sons rebels, and the father goes into captivity. And he has a son named Shul, I believe, in captivity.
Okay.
And Shul goes and fights his brother, and he reclaims the kingdom for his father, and is later enthroned, and he gets the kingdom.
Right.
Right? That's Jesus
Jesus.
Christ,
Yep.
Lucifer, and God the Father.
Yep.
And I caught this too, which is interesting. So Shul is born in captivity. It says he was a mighty man. He was righteous, and he went to a place that they call the Mount Ephraim, or the Hill Ephraim, and he arms all the people who rebel with swords that he forges out of the ore of or Hill, the Hill Ephraim. And I was like, that's a parallel directly. That's just so on the nose with the Lord using the tribe of Ephraim as
Yep.
his people to restore the kingdom.
Yep.
That's
Yep.
just fascinating to me. That was one thing I picked up on my most recent read through for this of Ether. I never caught onto that
And
before.
it fits who Ephraim was, right? I
It
mean,
fits the paradigm of Christ and our tribal identity and our work to a
right.
T.
Yep. Yep. If I'm not mistaken, one of Ephraim's biggest faux pas, and I can't remember where it was, but Ephraim shows up to do battle and is mad because no one invited him to go battle.
Yeah, it was when they went to go sack the tribe of Benjamin,
Right.
right?
And they show up and they're like, "Why didn't you call me, bro?"
Yeah.
right?
They want
Like
to fight.
this is our thing. And then instead of like they go to war with the people they were going to like be fighting alongside, right?
I
I mean,
know.
it's totally
And,
Ephraim.
and judges, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so another interesting thing that Moroni shows us, and presumably what Ether is showing us, right? Because it's Ether's original document. He is showing us his um the divine right of kings, his mantle for the kingship,
Right.
right? Because he's the son. Like he gives us his genealogy that goes right back to the first king of the Jaredite nation. So
Interesting.
he's asserting his right to the kingship.
Interesting.
And in spite of that, he's his whole life he was in exile. He was actually also one of those born in captivity. But his narrative breaks the cycle. He doesn't try to reclaim the throne. He doesn't wage war against Coriantumr, which is in the days of Shiz and
Mm-hmm.
Coriantumr, right? He doesn't try to reclaim the throne from Coriantumr. In fact, he devotes his life as a prophet to the Lord. And the Lord tells Ether, if you can convince Coriantumr to repent, he'll have the kingdom. But this, to me, mirrors Christ,
Yeah.
who was the Davidic line. Christ
Right.
had the authority and the lineage to be the Davidic king,
Right.
and did not assert that.
Interesting. So it's kind of types and shadows
Yeah,
again.
Ether is a bold type and shadow of Christ, and that occurred to me this read through, and I've never heard that from anyone else, but it's
No.
clear as day. Very
Yeah.
interesting.
Ooh.
So those are always fun.
Yeah, it is. That's absolutely fun. Huh. Makes it never ceases to amaze me that throughout all these different societies, right? The type and shadow of Christ always emerges, right? The Father and the Son,
Hmm.
right? Even Greek mythology, right? Zeus and Hercules,
Sure.
um, Thor and Odin,
Yeah.
right?
Odin's
Over
really
and
interesting.
over again, right? This idea of a father and son kinship, and if we see it in those kind of heathen nations, for lack of a better term, we should expect to see it in a book like Ether.
Some things are confounded though, but yeah, it's there. But did you know that Odin was crucified on the world tree?
I did,
Yeah,
I did. Yep, interesting.
very.
Yep, yep. And so there's things at play here that we just do not understand all the way around, right? But the echoes are there over and over and over.
Yeah. And we'll talk about some more echoes here. Not of Christ in particular, but just other sacred stuff. Very sacred stuff, so I'll try to be careful. But so with the brother of Jared at the beginning of the record, we have a temple ascent setting
Okay.
in Ether chapter 3, especially. You know, 2 and 3, I think. It's very similar to second, let's say, so Isaiah has a temple ascent thing in Isaiah 6. That's where a temple ascent is where the initiate is called back into the presence of the Lord,
Right.
into the rest of the Lord. First Nephi 1 happens with Lehi when
Right.
he sees the pillar of fire, he's offered sacrifices, and he sees the Father and the Son and concourses of angels, which is concourses mean a circle.
Right.
And they're singing hymns, and Hugh Nibley and others point out that ancient Christian prayer circles were called choruses, which is,
Right.
so they were actually singing and dancing with repetitive movements. Uh,
Huh.
yeah. So
Huh.
Lehi is having a temple experience with angels in a circle, a chorus, concourses. Anyway, so in Ether, you have a similar thing happening with the brother of Jared, right? And so he goes to the Mount Shelem, which um, in Hebrew is has the same word root for the last part of Melchizedek, or
Right.
no, or Melchizedek was called King of Peace, right? So King of Shalem, So the brother of Jared goes up to the Mount of the Peace, Mount of Peace, Mount Shalom, Or you could call it the Mount of the Melchizedek ones or whatever. Something,
Right.
someplace that's holy. It's a temple, right?
Right. Yeah.
You know, so the setting's there. He goes up there with 16 stones, which is very interesting considering, especially considering the fact that we don't know of any connections between Hebrew culture and their culture, but the numerology is important. 16 stones, for example, was the exact number of stones worn by the high priest in Israel.
Right.
You had um, on his chest, you had 12 that had the names of the tribes written on those stones. And then you had two on his shoulder, one on each shoulder. And then in a pouch, the pouch that had the 12 stones on it,
Right.
there was two more stones. That was
Interesting.
the Urim and Thummim.
Okay.
And so you have 16 stones with the high priest. So now you have you have Mahonri Mori Ankumer, the brother of Jared, acting as if he's the high priest with the 16 stones
Right.
in the temple on the mountain.
Huh.
Okay, you following me so
Yeah,
far?
I am. Yep.
And he goes up to the top of the mountain and he cries unto the Lord three times. And he converses with the Lord through a cloud.
Mm-hmm.
And the first thing he sees is the hand of the Lord.
Interesting.
And then he is brought into the rest of the Lord.
Interesting.
And so
Into the
that is his temple
rest.
ascent. And he's acting as the high priest in the temple,
Ooh,
symbolically.
very symbolic. Yep.
Yeah, but literal in this case, honestly. But the imagery, symbolic imagery is supplied. For those of us who know what to look for, it's there.
Right. Right. That is fascinating.
Yeah,
And you're right. For those initiated in temple work, this it would be familiar.
right. Yeah, it would be. Um, I thought this was fun. I don't have any particular commentary on this, but so we deal with the Book of Ether as an abridgment, and so we don't have a lot of Ether's words. But as I was going through it carefully, there was one verse that stuck out that was this is a quote directly from Ether.
Okay.
It's not just because most of the Book of Ether is honestly just Moroni's commentary.
Right.
But it's Ether 12, 3 and 4. And he says, by faith all things are fulfilled. Wherefore, whosoever believeth in God might with a surety hope for a better world, yea, even a place at the right hand of God, which hope cometh of faith, maketh an anchor to the souls of men, which would make them sure and steadfast, always abounding in good works, being led to glorify God. So that's always important to me to point out like the actual sayings of a prophet,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and that can be pondered upon by anyone listening to this, and but that directly precedes, you know, what is it, Ether 12, yeah, 12:6, the famous quote, which is
Right.
I give unto men weakness that they may be humble,
Right.
and so
Yep.
forth, and grace, and if my grace is sufficient to all men if they humble themselves before me and have faith in me, then therefore I will make weak things strong unto them. But that's Moroni,
Right.
right? Um, Later in that chapter, Moroni has another good one-liner. He says, actually, it's Christ. Christ has a good one-liner. Moroni is writing it down.
Right.
He Christ tells Moroni that faith, hope, and charity bringeth unto me the fountain of all righteousness. And as I've been reading, have you read all of In the Language of Adam yet?
No,
So, but you have it, right? We've talked about that.
I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you've been reading that. So, the great work that those guys are doing, they talk about and we've talked about it in this class, but I've also talked about the seven-part temple ascent. But the three-part temple ascent is part of this process, right? That we're the ultimate capstone is being brought into the presence of the Father and the Son, like the brother of Jared that we just talked about. But the mental framework, which we also talked about, was being preserved in like the books of Enoch and stuff because they had no temple anymore; it was destroyed. Ways to phrase that mental framework is considering faith, hope, and charity being individual rooms in the temple.
Oh, interesting.
And so faith, hope, and charity bringeth to me the fountain of all righteousness. The fountain of all righteousness in the Temple of Solomon, the stone that the ark was on was called the foundation stone.
Right.
And under the foundation stone was mythologically the place where the waters uh, erupted during the flood and the first place that they receded. It was like the sinkhole that sucked all the.
Interesting.
And so that's where God's throne was. Sim in the ancient Near East way of looking at things, God conquering chaos because chaos is symbolized by the
Well,
waters, the
waters.
depth,
Yep.
right? Like we talked about how Noah is just a
Yep.
recounting of Genesis, right? Like
Right.
that God's face, God, the Spirit of God dwelt upon the face of the deep, right?
Right. Right.
And
Yep.
then the ark was there too, right? Upon the waters,
Right. And so
illustrating
the
God.
ark once again is on the.
Well, the foundation stone was in the Holy of Holies. That's where the throne of God was. And so Christ is saying, faith, hope, and charity bringeth unto me the fountain of righteousness. Or
Oh,
faith, hope, and charity are the rooms that bring you into the Holy of Holies. And so
interesting.
faith is defined as very succinctly with First Nephi 3:7, I think, which is, I will go and I will do the things that the Lord
Okay.
commands, for I believe that the Lord will not issue any commands save that he will fulfill a way for the children of men to accomplish it, right? That's
Right.
faith, right? The second is hope, sometimes considered to be analogous, but it's not.
Hold on one second. I want to stay there at God's throne
Okay, go, yep, go for it.
because there is a scripture and it's in one of the five books of Moses, and I can't remember which one. Forgive me. I can always remember what I read, but I can never remember exactly
Oh,
where I read it.
you're good.
But the Lord says to the children of Israel, "I'll meet you at the mercy seat." Right? And so this idea of the faith, hope, and charity brings forth the fountains. The mercy seat was on the ark,
Yes, it was
right? Where's the ark rest?
on the foundation
On the
stone.
foundation where the fountain was,
Right.
right? And again, you could tie mercy into um, charity,
Into the atonement. Yep.
right? And I just found that interesting,
It is. No, and so hope is the assurance of the resurrection,
right?
and charity is defined as attaining the attributes of godliness.
Right,
So that, as John says in the New Testament, that when we see him, we shall be like him.
right,
And the lectures on faith, if you've read those, the whole criteria is that we can't be saved unless we conform ourselves into his image. Not that we, but and it's totally against the idea of the Trinitarian God, that God is the same as the Son, but that we will become exalted if we conform ourselves to the attributes or image
right.
of the Son. And that's the same way that Christ became God, was by
Yep,
conforming himself to the attributes of his Father.
absolutely. Woo.
And so faith, hope, and charity bringeth you, me, or whoever into the Holy of Holies to receive that calling and election, made sure the fountain of all
Absolutely.
righteousness, to be born again,
Absolutely. Yeah.
enthroned on the mercy seat as God.
Yeah. Wow. Holy cow. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And temple motif there.
Yeah, that's straight from Christ.
Holy cow.
Yeah, Moroni defines faith, or not, sorry. After this conversation that Moroni has with Christ, Moroni defines hope as in Ether 12, verse 32. He says, I also remember that thou hast said, that thou hast prepared a house for man, yea, even among the mansions of thy father, in which man might have a more excellent hope. Wherefore man must hope, or he cannot receive an inheritance in that place which thou hast prepared. So I just want to do that as a proof text to show you that it's not just
Right.
the same thing as faith.
Right. Yeah.
And he also defines charity in I think that's Moroni 7, but he says, I remember that thou hast said that thou hast loved the world, even unto the laying down of thy life for the world, that thou mightest take it up again to prepare a place for the children of men. And I know that this love which thou hast for the children of men is charity. Wherefore, except all men should have charity, they cannot inherit the place which thou hast prepared in the mansions of thy Father. And lecture 7 on the lectures on faith says, when men begin to live by faith, they begin to draw near to God, and when faith is perfected, they are like him. And because he is saved, they are saved also. For they will be in the same situation he is in, because they have come to him, and when he appears, they shall be like him, for they will see him as he is.
Wow. You know, it's funny. People say that they can't find the temple
In the Book of
in the
Mormon,
Book of Mormon, right? You got the
I
one
know
reference to, it was like Solomon's temple, save it be out of timber. But it's there if you know what you're looking for.
it is. And that's why I'm so grateful for the work that Dave Butler and Mike Day have been doing, because
Yeah.
they're all about that.
Yep. Yep.
If I
Absolutely.
was president of the LDS Church, I would put them in charge of
CES right now.
PES right now and the Temple Committee and get them to have to play with the liturgy of the temple endowment and
Right.
all that. Sure as hell beat what they got now.
Yeah, absolutely. Whew.
They were joking one day that they would have when we were going over the primary Adam literature, right? And we were talking about how in the early Christian stuff with the fall of Satan, they had the angels beating him up and
Right.
ripping off his wings and breaking his ribs and
Yep.
and
Yep.
removing the priesthood from his hands and
Yep.
cutting his head off and all that stuff.
Yep.
Dave Butler joked. He said, "I want to put that. I would put that back in the endowment and have a bunch of angels beating up the Lucifer."
Oh, that's hilarious.
Yeah.
It'd be like watching a UFC fight inside the temple. Uh,
Yeah, no, there's a place well, not to be too light about that, but it's the way that the early Christians presented that would be very relevant to have something like that.
right.
To have some to show Lucifer being divested of his status,
Right. Oh, absolutely it would be.
especially with the way it used to be done with, it's not done this way in the LDS church anymore. He doesn't wear an apron, but we know that he was invested with what he said was an apron that was a symbol of his power and priesthoods.
Yep. Yep. And
And
there's
to see things like that being taken, but then he appears later without it, right? To
right.
see that and being divested of that would be cool,
Yeah, that
in
would
my
carry
opinion.
some weight, right?
Yeah,
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Whew. I'm always scared to play with the liturgy too much.
I am too. So I'm talking all hypothetical here, but I'm just saying it would get the point across,
Right.
and it
Yep.
fits.
Right.
It
Yeah.
could fit.
Yep. Yep. No, I agree. All right. Is there anything else in there?
Yeah, I mean, if we have time,
Yeah.
see if I can handle this. This is probably the most complex part of the presentation, going back to Melchizedek.
Okay.
And so we talked about who is he, who isn't he, is he Shem, maybe. Um, the Book of Mormon definitely asserts that Melchizedek is a historical character. So
Right.
I put my pin in that. We know
Okay.
that. We know that much, right? Because Alma goes to the city of Ammonihah, and it's interesting there because even there's temple liturgy in those chapters.
Right.
Zeezrom says, playing a lawyer, playing the adversary, because what is a prosecuting attorney?
Right. An adversary.
Especially in Hebrew thought, the ha Satan, is an adversary. Yeah, so
The accuser.
yeah, exactly. So Zeezrom's a lawyer by trade. It says that it goes into the whole shebang about, by the way, this is his trade. He makes his money off of the cases that he tries to get out of the people and sowing contention among the people, and his people, lawyers, through
Right.
lawyercraft, make their money off of the contention of the people, and then he goes and offers Alma and Amulek money to deny the existence of a supreme being.
Ooh, that is that is interesting.
And it's right after Alma gets off a mission saying, "I was in the land of Melek," which is the first component of the word Melchizedek,
Right.
which means king. And he says to us, and he began to teach the people in the land of Melek, which would be, or the land of the king,
Right.
according to the holy order of God. And he taught the people of Gideon many of things which could not be written. So he had just gotten out of a city called Gideon and Melek, and he taught them after the holy order of God and many things which could not be written. We know that's temple stuff.
Yep.
It never says priesthood, I don't think, in the Book of Mormon, but it says the holy order of God multiple times. And so that's what the priesthood is.
It's got to be. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we know from Joseph Smith translation, um, that the order of Melchizedek, the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek was originally called the order after the Son of God.
Right.
And so he gets into Ammonihah and he says, "How have ye forgotten the traditions of your fathers?" So he's not just talking to infidels; he's talking to apostates. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's tons of things going on between them that illustrate these temple motifs, and we just talked about one of them about the money, right? And Amulek even tells the people, "I have seen much of his mysteries, meaning God's mysteries. Nevertheless, I did harden my heart, and I was called many times, but I would not hear. Therefore, I knew concerning these things, yet I would not know. Therefore, I went on rebelling against God." So even Amulek is familiar with temple stuff,
Right. Yep.
but he was inactive.
Right. Right. Amulek's interesting because he gives up so much.
Oh, he is, and he was a polygamist,
Yep. Yep.
by the way.
He
If you
was.
read the Book of Mormon carefully, it says
Yep.
that, yeah, talks about his children,
And
his
his
riches,
riches
and his
and his women.
women.
Yep. Yep. And everyone will be like, well, it could be his daughters. And I'm like,
Children was just mentioned.
yeah, children was just mentioned. And it never mentions his wives or wife, right? And so it absolutely has some allusions to him living in plural marriage.
Yeah. But anyway, so after being after teaching things according to the order of the priesthood, he starts doing it again in Ammonihah. And he says, Alma says, "It is given unto many to know the mysteries of God. Nevertheless, they are laid under a strict command that they shall not impart, only according to the portion of the word which he doth grant unto the children of men." So
Mhm.
be selective about what you say about it. And
Right.
you're told not to repeat, right?
Yep.
According to the heed and diligence which they give unto him. And they that will harden their hearts, to them is given a lesser portion of the word until they know nothing concerning his mysteries, which is rights,
Right.
you
Yep.
know, rights and ordinances. And then they are taken captive by the devil and led by his will down to destruction, which is also part of the old temple liturgy.
Yep.
And then Alma goes on saying, "They were ordained after this manner, being called with a holy calling and ordained with a holy ordinance." So he just says ordinance straight up. That's a temple rite.
Yeah, he's being a little more overt in that phrase there.
And he says, "And taking upon them the high priesthood of the holy," so it does say priesthood, the high priesthood of the holy order. So he's defining the holy order as being the priesthood. So in the previous mission to Melik, he was teaching them about the priesthood, which calling an ordinance and high priesthood is without beginning or end. Thus they become high priests forever, after the order of the Son, the only begotten of the Father, who is without beginning of days or end of years. Therefore they were called after this holy order and were sanctified, and their garments were made white through the blood of the Lamb. So you have ordinances, you have garments that are white. Um, Melchizedek, who was also a high priest after the same order of which I have spoken, who also took upon him the high priesthood forever. And it was the same Melchizedek to whom Abraham paid tithes. Yea, even our father Abraham paid tithes of 1/10 part of all he possessed. Now these ordinances were given after this manner, that thereby the people might look forward to the Son of God, it being a type of his order, and that they might look forward to him for a remission of their sins, and that they might enter into the rest of the Lord. And it goes on to describe that Melchizedek was king of the land of Salem. His people were wicked, and he exercised mighty faith to reclaim them. And he
Right.
taught them the gospel, right? And so we know that he's historical. But it really asserts hardcore temple liturgy stuff all throughout here. Um, being called or ordained into that holy order with signs that you would be shown to recognize the Savior when he came,
Right.
is what he's saying, right? Ordinances were given after this manner that the people might look forward on the Son of God. I would say that that has something to do with the crucifixion.
I think so.
All right, so Melchizedek means king of righteousness, right? So Mulek, Moloch, the MLK root means king in Hebrew, and Zadok or Zedek. Zadok was one of the priests of David and Solomon. But the ZDK root means righteous. And so Zedekiah
Right.
um, means Jehovah is righteous. Zadok just means righteous or whatever. Um, I'm sure if I wanted to, I could think of others. The Joseph Smith translation seems to imitate or insinuate also that after the city of Enoch was translated, Melchizedek's city might have been translated. It says, and his people wrought righteousness and obtained heaven,
Right.
and sought for the city of Enoch which God had before taken. And Melchizedek was called the king of heaven by his people, or in other words, the king of peace.
Mm.
So that also might be a historical component
Yeah.
for this time period, right? Talking about the Tower of Babel, the Jaredites. This is all contemporary. This is all happening in space near each other. Abraham, Melchizedek, Nimrod, the brother of Jared. This is all in close space. We don't
Right.
know much, so a lot's being compiled, right, into this lesson. Um, some people have pointed out that, in support of that idea of Melchizedek being translated is the fact that it's not a new idea from Latter-day Saints. It's
No,
actually an old idea.
it is.
Because you go back to the Enoch literature that we went through, um, you go into Second Enoch, you find out that Melchizedek was actually born to, I think he would be Noah's nephew.
Hmm.
So Lamech had a son named Ner, and so Noah and Ner were brothers. And well, interestingly enough, Ner is not the father of Melchizedek, but Ner's wife conceives miraculously, I might add.
Mm.
And Melchizedek is born, and he's born wearing the robes of the high priesthood. And then the archangel Michael comes and takes him into heaven, and then drops him back on earth after the flood.
Wow.
Yeah, that's the story there.
Just a legend, so to speak,
Yeah,
right?
but it shows you that this idea of Melchizedek being translated into heaven is not
Not
novel.
new, not unique to Latter-day Saint tradition.
Right. And so that this one flies in the face of him being identified with Shem, right? Um, and there's reasons for that. There it kind of goes into this. I don't know if I can articulate it too well, but it goes back into the sphere of what we talked about with all the Dead Sea Scroll stuff, right? With like how they adopted Enoch as the messianic figure that would,
Right,
they're staking a claim on authority that predates Moses because the Levites in charge of the apostate temple
right,
were through through the Levite line, and so they were staking on Enoch and having a prophet, priest, or angel, a divine being coming back and restoring the temple, restoring them to the priesthood,
right.
the older priesthood, right?
Yep.
They were banking on that. So it's similar ideas with Melchizedek, right?
Right.
So he factors in very much the same way in Dead Sea Scroll literature that we talked about with Enoch.
Yeah. There's so much of this too that, Brigham had said of Genesis that um it was a dark saying, right?
Yeah, he does say that. Yeah, Moses' dark sayings, especially with the rib allegory, right?
Right.
That Eve was created out of the rib.
And so sometimes with some of these extra canonical stories like this, you have to look at it in that sense, right?
You
That
do.
they're trying to communicate something
Well, what are they? So
without giving everything away.
they are. And so when you see this story in Second Enoch, and Melchizedek's born miraculously,
Right.
and what is it? Without father,
Right.
which then is the uh, it, this is the a potential origin for the explanation of what it says in the Book of Hebrews, that
Right.
Melchizedek was without father, without mother, because
Yep.
they're drawing on the source materials they had for Melchizedek.
Yep.
And we already know, I think we already talked about. If we haven't, we're going to talk about it. How Melchizedek was the template for um, Christ.
Yeah, we have
You,
talked about that. Yeah.
we've talked about that, and so was Enoch. So we talked about how in the Enochian literature, Enoch sees this vision of the Son of Man. And so anyone who had read out in the desert where the Dead Sea Scrolls people were circulating the Book of Enoch, anyone who heard Christ say, "I am the Son of Man," knew what he was saying.
Yep.
I'm the Messiah.
Yep.
And so he wasn't just quoting Daniel about being the son of Adam.
Right.
You know,
No, he was making allusions to something else.
Right. And so the early Christians used the books of Enoch and this other Melchizedek literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls to beef up their case for
Right.
Christ,
Yep.
saying that Christ was ordained after the order of Melchizedek, which was without father or mother, right? And and here there's the legend that
Right.
kind of illustrates that. It's symbolic, but it
Right.
gives more
It's still,
context.
yeah, it gives way more context and kind of gives you a key that something bigger is going on here than what's just in the text.
This is going to get heavy. Can we take a break for a second?
Yeah.
Okay, back at it. How do I want to put this? Another thing that's interesting is the temple is female. I
Yes.
don't know. I don't know if I want to expound on that too much.
No, we probably better not because I think we'd be getting into some.
Yeah,
Yep.
but that also factors in with being with the Melchizedek legend.
Right.
If he's born without father or mother, because he's reborn in a temple symbolically,
Right.
that also fits. That's what
Yep.
that's what I want to say about that.
Yep.
Right. And the same goes for any other person who attains to the same position. It's not just
Yep.
him, but it's those who receive all the same promises.
Right.
Um, let's see. So yeah, in Second Enoch, you have this miraculous birth, and he's born, you know, coming from the womb of his mother, But then in Psalm 110, um, the King James, I've heard that this is a really tough translation from the Greek is the best way to understand it,
Okay.
which I don't speak Greek. I want to. So I don't like, I'll try to do this justice. But
Okay.
um, all I have is I looked at a multitude of English translations.
Okay.
I looked at the ESV, the KG, the King James, the NRSV. I looked at a lot of them. Um, but what section Psalms 110 talks about Melchizedek? It's that whole phrase. Do I have the whole thing here? I'll just read it from the King James real quick. The relevant parts, not the whole thing.
Okay.
It's like two verses, the relevant parts. Also, some people think Psalms are the oldest part of the Bible besides the book of Job.
Really.
Yeah, because Psalms, they say, um, is actually encapsulating in poetic form the temple liturgy from the first temple period.
Interesting.
And so the pretty much the rest of the Old Testament is second temple period.
Okay.
Like even, taking the secular view, um, our current form of the Pentateuch, the first five books of Moses, weren't written until after the Babylonian
Right.
captivity, right? So right when they're entering the second temple period.
Okay.
But Psalms are older. And so that's
Interesting.
a better way of looking at what Israelite religion looked like before the Babylonian captivity.
Okay.
So they say. So the Psalm of David, so it's attributed to David, that's first temple
Mm-hmm.
period. The Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion, rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. Thy people shall be willing in the day of thy power, in the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. Thou hast the dew of thy youth. Terrible translation.
Hmm.
But it's more like you're gonna, you know, the Lord or God says unto you, another God, sit on my right hand, I will make your enemies my footstool, and you will come arrayed in beautiful garments out of the womb of dawn.
Interesting.
So this has born again imagery,
Yes, it does.
coming out of the
Yep.
womb. It
Yep.
has the Melchizedek imagery that talking about the second Enoch stuff about
Yep.
Melchizedek being born out of
Yep.
the womb of his mother miraculously. You know,
Right.
so Some people have said that this is David, or Christ, So it's symbolic language of kingship,
Yep.
being born out of the womb of the dawn, or the womb of the morning is another translation of
Right.
dawn, which just goes back to fitting Hebrews saying Melchizedek was born without father and without mother. Um, Another tangent that's interesting is an early Jewish philosopher named Philo, who was famous for constructing like the Platonic theology of early Christianity. The early Christians adopted it, and so it was late. He was a Jew; he wasn't a Christian, but he coined the logos concept.
Right. The word, yeah.
So the Word of God embodied, right?
Right.
So he identified Melchizedek with the logos.
Interesting.
And so, just like with what we saw with Enoch, subsuming, because in Hellenistic Judaism, they had to remove the anthropological view of God, they needed an intercessor. And so the person became Michael,
Mm-hmm.
or this Logos that's also called Christ, not Christ, Christ later by the Christians, but Melchizedek by the Jews, or Enoch, right? All,
Okay.
all becomes this figure that's the mediator between humanity and God, because God is unapproachable, right?
Right.
So Enoch, Melchizedek, Michael are all playing the same role in these stories.
Right.
At Qumran, which is the Dead Sea Scrolls community, this group was focused on ritual purity and priestly activity. So they were actually exiled priests. And they did a lot of baptisms. In fact, they did some part of, we don't know how homogenous the Qumran community was, but we know a lot, part of them did ritual baptisms every day
Really.
for cleanliness. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm. And they were opposed to the Levitical priesthood at the time in Jerusalem. And to remedy the situation, like we established, they had to create a new priesthood claim around a divine esch eschacal esch eschatological priest who rules over the judgment of the good and the evil. And this is precisely how a document that the scholars say, they call it a 11Q Melchizedek, or 11 um 11Q is called the Song of the Sabbath Sacrifice.
Okay.
There's also 1Q Melchizedek. 1QM is the War Scroll, which is the war of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, which is
Mm-hmm.
relevant. And then there's 1Q20, which is called the Genesis Apocryphon, which has to do with some Melchizedek stuff too. The Genesis Apocryphon is basically like Genesis with more commentary
Gotcha.
on stuff like Melchizedek.
Yeah.
And so the Song of the Sabbath Sacrifice describes Melchizedek in the same manner that Enoch becomes a heavenly scribe and guide, and Melchizedek becomes the priest in the heavenly temple,
Okay.
which Michael also occupies in other literature. In fact, this has led, there's nothing super explicit, but every scholar is pretty much on board with the idea that it seems that the Qumran community type people equated Michael the Archangel and Melchizedek.
We all can kind of conflate. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that they equated the two.
Hmm.
And we'll describe that in a bit. So, what I'm talking about here is the eschatological Melchizedek versus the historical Melchizedek.
Okay. Eschatological meaning what?
End of times thinking.
Okay.
So it's the end times prophecies, the prophets, you know, that kind of stuff. For example, one of the scholars um, argues that Melchizedek is called a god in some of these scriptures. Um, he's associated with the word Elohim. He's called, Melchizedek is called an Elohim, and he performs similar tasks to Michael the Archangel in other literature.
Hmm.
Um, for He is called in the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice. Melchizedek is called the Prince of Light and the Prince of Truth, I think, which is
Hmm.
those are also titles for
Right.
Michael.
Yep.
But this is at the actual text. I'm going to read some of this
Okay.
from the song of the Sabbath sacrifice. It says, "And concerning what Scripture says, in this year of Jubilee you shall return, every one of you, your property, to your property. And what is also written, quote, and this is the manner of remission. Every creditor shall remit the claim that is held against a neighbor, not exacting it of a neighbor who is a member of the community, because Elohim's remission has been proclaimed. The interpretation is that it applies to the last days and concerns the captives, just as Isaiah said, to proclaim the Jubilee to the captives, and whose teachers have been hidden and kept secret, even from the inheritance of Melchizedek, that they are the inheritance of Melchizedek, who will return to them to what is rightfully theirs. He will proclaim to them the Jubilee, therefore releasing them from the debt of all their sins. This word will thus come in the first week of the Jubilee period that follows the 9 Jubilee periods. Then the Day of Atonement shall follow the end of the 10th Jubilee period, when he shall atone for all the sons of light and all that are predestined to Melchizedek. Upon them, for this is the time decreed, for the year of Melchizedek's favor, for his hosts together with the holy ones of Elohim, for a kingdom of judgment, just as it is written concerning him in the songs of David, which is what we read in Psalms 10
Right.
earlier. Elohim has taken, sorry, that's actually Psalms 82. Um, Elohim has taken his place in the council of Elohim. In the midst of the Elohim, he holds
Hmm.
judgment. So he's saying Melchizedek is
Ooh.
the Elohim that holds counsel with the Elohim and sits in judgment.
Some exaltation going on there.
Scripture also says about him, over it take your seat in the highest heaven. Elohim will judge the peoples. Concerning what the scripture says, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? The interpretation applies to Belial and the spirits predestined to him, because all of them have rebelled, turning from Elohim's precepts and becoming so utterly wicked. Therefore, Melchizedek will thoroughly prosecute the vengeance required by Elohim's statutes. In that day, he will deliver them from the powers of Belial and from the powers of all the spirits predestined to him. Allied with him will be all the righteous divine beings. This is that which he has decreed through Isaiah the prophet concerning all the captives, inasmuch as the scriptures say, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace and who brings good news, and who announces salvation, and who says, your Elohim reigns. The scripture's interpretation, mountains are the prophets, they who were sent to proclaim God's truth and to prophesy to all Israel, and the messenger is the anointed of the Spirit, of whom Daniel spoke. The messenger who brings good news and who announces salvation is the one whom is written to proclaim the year of the Lord or Jehovah's favor in the day of vengeance of our Elohim, to comfort all who mourn. This scripture's interpretation, he is to instruct them all about the period of history for eternity and in the statutes of the truth.
Hmm.
So if you missed it, the important part here is that the scroll of the Sabbath sacrifice has Melchizedek reading out of Isaiah and Deuteronomy, the same text that Christ read in Galilee in Nazareth when he said, "In this day
Oh.
is the scripture fulfilled in your ears. I have been sent to proclaim liberty to the captives and to proclaim the day of the Lord's favor." But in this, it says instead of saying Jehovah's favor, the Lord's favor, it's the day of Melchizedek's favor. So it quotes that
Whew.
same scripture but inserts Melchizedek for Jehovah.
Hmm. So what's its claim then when it's coming to Melchizedek? What are they claiming here?
They're just claiming, I think, the people writing this are claiming one, a divine being is coming, and one, the interpretation that is commonly had amongst the Jews is that the Jubilee is just temporal, but they're saying actually that it's spiritual, and he's saying that Melchizedek will atone for the sins of the people, and that's the Jubilee. That's the debts being forgiven. and
So they're putting Melchizedek in the messianic.
position before Christ because this community existed 100 years before Christ.
Okay, so
So this is
there
prefiguring Christ's mission.
is it prefiguring, or they does this group literally believe that Melchizedek is the one that will atone for
I think
people?
it's a title.
Okay, all right.
I think it's a title, and I think
So they're looking at Melchizedek as a type and shadow of the Christ to come.
there's some interesting things happening here for sure because I don't know, we don't know a lot about these Dead Sea Scrolls people at Qumran, but a lot of scholars say John the Baptist was involved with them and Christ was involved with them.
Hmm.
And Luke quotes that scripture. Luke, in the Gospel of Luke is where he recounts that Christ went to Nazareth and
And
read
they were
this.
100 years before the time of Christ.
Yeah, it would make sense, therefore, in my opinion, for to make the claim that Christ is capitalizing on a message that had already been sent out to the people that they would have been familiar with. And that's probably why also they're so upset with him, is because all the sectarians, um, under the rule of the mainline, Judaic priests, were not in favor of that kind of interpretation. But if Christ is getting up there and saying, "I am the one," whom they are saying out there in the desert that there's going to be a person coming out and saying your sins are forgiven, and that's the real debt.
Oh, okay.
He's claiming that for himself right there.
Okay, and they're using the title of Melchizedek as a way, almost like a placeholder
King of
until,
righteousness.
yeah, okay. Okay. All right. So Melchizedek being a title.
Yeah.
Okay. So there is, and this is where I think okay, I'm just going to speak for myself. This is where it can confuse me, and I would assume it confused maybe a few other people,
Yes, we should talk about that.
right? Because we have Melchizedek the man,
Yeah, the
and then we
historical
have
Melchizedek.
Melchizedek the title.
Yeah.
And so this group from 100 years before Christ is looking for the coming of the man who will bear the title Melchizedek,
Yeah, and I bring this up because
King of righteousness being Christ.
yeah, and I think it's important.
Okay.
One, because I just think it's important to talk about Christ in this
Yep.
sense, but also looking at we don't have much on Melchizedek. Like this is some of the newest stuff, the last 100 years that's come out. This is all we have. And so we have to kind of backtrack after reading this and extrapolate
Right.
what maybe we can glean from what does this eschatological Melchizedek reflect about the historical one.
Right.
I don't know if I have answers for that, but I thought this was fascinating, and so I had to include it.
Absolutely, that's fascinating. And if you're an Adam God believer, it does fit with titles, right? And it does follow that same motif that we look at in the Adam God doctrine with Elohim being a title, Jehovah being a title. Wow.
Yeah, and so in the war of the Sons of Light, against the Sons of Darkness, Michael's fulfilling that role.
Right.
Again, it's Michael against Belial, which is Satan.
Right.
But in this song of the Sabbath sacrifice, it's Melchizedek against the
Right.
Belial, right? And it's Melchizedek performing the atonement, freeing the captives, as Christ said he would do,
Oh, okay.
and proclaiming peace.
Right.
And Christ came on the scene and said, "In this day, the Scripture is fulfilled." But this is profound to me that there existed a line of thought in this period of time that was already established. That
Right.
interpretation was already established. It was not mainline,
Right.
but it was not novel, and it
Okay.
predated Christ and led up to his ministry, and went before him and allowed him to have a successful ministry.
Okay. All right. No, that's tracking now. I see where it's going. I see what it's doing there. Whew, that's deep stuff.
It is deep stuff, and so it defeats the secular and even Jewish, the Jewish apologists to this day. People like Mormons will point out, our doctrine of the plurality of gods and say, well, it says in Psalms, Elohim will sit among the Elohim, and they're like, well, that's really just these. Elohim can also mean that they're judges.
Right.
They're mortal men. But this interpretation from the Dead Sea Scrolls does
Does
not
not support that whatsoever.
not one bit. it prefigures Mormonism's doctrine and early Christian doctrine.
Right.
100%.
Whew. Boy, and there's a lot you can go back and unpack from that.
And it's why this stuff was buried and hid because this it was too Christian for the Jews to accept anymore, and then the Christians philosophized it away afterwards.
Yeah,
And they were hunting things down and burning it and destroying it, and so it all had to be hid away.
mm. Yeah, and I'm sitting here thinking about how all the ways it could work, right? I mean, just for argument's sake, if Shem is Melchizedek,
Yeah,
right? Well, now all of a sudden that name Melchizedek becomes more like a title like bishop,
right.
right? And then same thing with Christ when he comes to fulfill that role. He's, Jesus the Melchizedek, right?
It's like saying the Son of Man.
Right. Yep.
Right.
Whew. Well, and now we have to ask a question, right? And this carries some implication. So if that's the case, then do we take upon ourselves as men, when we receive the Melchizedek priesthood, are there certain responsibilities now that run deeper that maybe we weren't aware of at the beginning of obtaining it, right?
Well,
Because the classic thought here in Mormonism is that the reason, and both can be true, I want to say, right? It was called the Melchizedek priesthood to avoid the vain repetition
hmm
of God's name. But maybe there's some deeper connotation there that we have to pay attention to. And because it's got a sense of foreshadowing of what we must become
yeah.
to bear that priesthood, not only in the eternities, but I would say probably here, because both of the guys who carried that title of Melchizedek had certain things to do, right? Melchizedek starts a city that I believe was translated correctly, correct?
hmm
Christ likewise performed some pretty impressive things, right? Um, whew,
So to,
it's got some
to
implications that
well,
are
to illustrate this, what does King Benjamin do at the temple in Zarahemla? He gathers all the people in the
yep,
temple, and he says, "I want to make a covenant with you. Will you covenant to take upon the name of Christ, or take upon yourself a new name, and the name shall be Christ?"
right. Ooh.
And so that equates kind of, this theme that Christ and the name Melchizedek, or the name of the that describes the priesthood, are the same.
Well, and see, now I'm going to dive into some even deeper stuff here, right? And it's something that I've thought about for a while, which is we 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 sit in sacrament each week and we partake of the sacrament, which is supposed to take upon us the name of Christ,
hmm
right? But we think of that as a passive thing on our part, right? That it's kind of passive, right? We're going to remember him. We're going to do the best we can, but really we're relying on him to cover us. And I think that is true. I think that's 100% true. But it could be deeper in the sense of, but we have stuff to do in addition to that covering.
That's so interesting. So covering, I don't know if I should say this, but I'm probably gonna anyways. Let's see if I can find it in the New Testament. What is a covering? Do you know? Or how would you answer that?
So it depends on what we're talking about, right? I mean, in the sense of Christ, it's that we're reliant upon his atonement, right?
Right, the Hebrew word for atonement is kafir, which is cover.
Right.
It just means to atonement's Latin and it means to become one, but the before Latin was being used in the Old Testament, kafir was the just to be covered.
Right.
Right. Um, and so the church, I'll put it this way, the church has recently, I think because it's coming under fire for garments and other stuff like that, they've recently, it's interesting because they've said, well, the garments are a symbol of your covenants with Christ and it's a symbol of the atonement. That's actually a fairly new line of thinking for the church,
Right.
but it's actually not wrong
No,
because what are you doing when you place, what do you cover with a garment?
your nakedness.
Well, your body. Yeah, you're covered. You're
Right.
covered. So yeah, so they've made that connection, right? The church to defend it, and it's right. It's 100% right. Um, Paul, the apostle. I don't know if I'm gonna have commentary on this. This is loaded though. So anyone who
Okay.
has ears to hear or eyes to see can see or hear. But
Okay.
Paul, in the last few verses of his epistle to the Galatians, when he's talking about circumcision
Mm-hmm.
and whether it's necessary to be circumcised and all that, because that's a covenant of God's people, right?
Right.
Or was. And then he says, "From henceforth, let no man trouble me," assuming trouble me about this
Right.
issue, right? For henceforth, let no man trouble me, for I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so, what's he wearing, or what are the marks that he bears in his body? Uh, what do the marks symbolize? How many markings are there? How many characters are in the name of Christ? Um, I want to say how many characters are in the name Jehovah?
Yeah, see, there is so much I want to talk about on this, but because it's on a podcast,
Yeah,
I can't get into it, right? But there's some other things that go along with that that I think could be applicable to that in the realm of ordinances.
they are. And so taking upon the new name that's Christ, taking upon yourself, as Paul says, the marks, I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus Christ, taking upon yourself the holy priesthood, the name of Melchizedek. These things are all interrelated.
Yeah. Whew. I honestly, dude, I don't know how much, like, if I'm afraid if I start talking, I'm gonna
No, I'm
start,
done. I'm done. We can end it right here.
if I start talking, I'm gonna say things that I should not say.
Yeah.
Um, go to the temple, everybody. Please go to the temple.
Uh,
And this will make sense.
it will make sense. I'm sorry for speaking cryptic. All I have to say is the gospel is true, the book is blue, and Jesus was a Mormon.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. That's pretty good. The book was blue. Very good. Well, dude, this has been awesome.
Thanks.
This has been awesome. So where you going from here? There's been some discussion about this could be the last one. It might not be the last one.
Maybe we should address that. Yeah, I've just been kind of bogged down lately, and I've been having trouble. I've been having trouble just staying on top of this content, and
dude, it's
so
deep stuff, right? And
it's
look,
a labor of love, and I'm grateful for the time to be able. Dude, I wouldn't have on my own. I wouldn't have gone into the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Book of Enoch stuff. Like I've
right.
learned so much from that.
Well, and it's a heavy lift, right? Because like each one of your packets there that you give out in your class, they're like 20 pages long,
Yeah, this one's
right?
this. Yeah, it is.
And so I get that it's a heavy lift. So there's no judgments, dude. But inquiring minds are going to want to know.
Yeah, I think this will be. I'm not entirely committed. I'm not entirely decided.
Okay.
I'm 90% sure that this will be the last one for a while on this subject. There are other projects that I'm working on that Dave and I will be talking about, and
I've tasked Michael. I've added to his stress.
and those will be coming when they're ready,
Yep.
and you guys can wonder about
Yep.
that.
Yep. Just know it'll be good stuff. Um, but dude, these have been awesome. And look, here's what I'd say. Don't give up on it entirely. Even if you do one a year,
Oh,
right?
sure. No, yeah, we could. I mean, I wanted to do Abraham more because there's so much on Abraham. We touched on that a little today. That was actually completely unintentional. It just came up because of
Sure.
Nimrod and all the stuff we have on a lot of the stuff on Nimrod was Abraham. But there's so much more on Abraham to do. And for example, I probably would have done one actually on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob together,
You kind of have to.
and it would have been awesome. There's really cool stuff there. But we're gonna have to hold off on that
Yep,
one.
yep. You got other stuff you're working on and whatnot. So how about this? How about this is it for now?
This is it for now.
Okay,
Maybe.
perfect. Awesome. Well, dude, I'm looking forward to your next big thing.
Yeah, me too.
It'll be good. So, all right. Dude, I always enjoy this. I love you. I'm glad to have these conversations with you.
Appreciate it.
So,
Likewise.
all right. Bye, everybody.